Silas Ketteridge didn't knock. He never knocked. The door of Fenwick Mercantile swung open hard enough to rattle the glass panel in its frame, and every customer inside went quiet the way people do when something dangerous enters a room. Silas was a big man, not tall, but wide through the chest and thick in the jaw, and he walked like a man who had never once been told no and expected that to continue indefinitely. He moved through the store without looking at the dry goods, without looking at the customers, without looking at anything except Rosalie Fenwick, who was standing behind the counter with a pencil in her hand and a ledger open in front of her. He crossed the floor in 8 steps, snatched the ledger off the counter, and threw it to the ground. "You don't need that anymore," he said. "You're going to be my wife by Friday." Rosalie didn't move. Her pencil was still in her hand. And every person in that store looked at the floor. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. We release new dramas every week, and the next one is even more shocking than this. Drop a like on this video, and tell us in the comments what city or country are you watching from. We love seeing how far stories travel. Now settle in, this one runs deep. The winter of 1883 came hard to Coldwater Ridge, Colorado. It came with a wind that found every crack in every wall, with snow that fell sideways and packed itself into drifts against the storefronts along the main road, and with a cold that settled into the bones of a person and stayed there until April. The town wasn't large, maybe 400 souls in good weather, somewhat fewer when the weather turned and the men with options went somewhere warmer. It sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines, close enough to the Durango freight route to stay supplied, far enough from anything else to feel like the edge of the known world. Fenwick Mercantile stood at the center of the main road, wedged between the post office and a farrier's shop that smelled permanently of iron and scorched hoof. It was not a beautiful building. The sign above the door had been painted by Rosalie's father 8 years ago and was now faded to the point where the letters were more suggestion than declaration. Porch boards had warped over 2 winters and needed replacing. Front window had a diagonal crack across the lower left corner that Rosalie had sealed with beeswax because glass was expensive, and the crack wasn't letting in much cold anyway. None of that mattered to the people of Coldwater Ridge. What mattered was that Fenwick Mercantile was always stocked, always open by 7 in the morning, always honest about its pricing, and run by a young woman who could calculate a bill in her head faster than most men could find their pencils. That young woman was Rosalie. She was 21 years old and large, in the way that some women are broadly built through the shoulders and hips, full through the face and arms, with the kind of body that drew looks from strangers and whispered comments from people who thought they were being quiet. She had thick, dark hair that she kept pinned back during work hours and let fall loose when she was alone in the store after closing. Her eyes were a clear, direct brown that people sometimes found unsettling because she did not drop them when someone stared. Her hands were capable, an ink stain from the ledger work she did every evening. She was, in almost every way that Coldwater Ridge had decided to measure a woman, considered undesirable. She was also the only reason Fenwick Mercantile was still open. Her mother, Lenora Fenwick, had been a capable woman once. Before Rosalie's father, Edmund, had died in a wagon accident 3 years ago, a wheel gone. A hillside slope, a morning that ended everything. Lenora had been the kind of woman who managed things quietly and well. After Edmund died, something in Lenora had cracked clean through, and what filled the space left behind was fear. Not grief exactly, though there was grief too, but fear was the dominant thing. Fear of debt, fear of failure, fear of what people would say when Fenwick Mercantile finally closed its doors because a widow without a man couldn't keep a store running in hard country. That fear made Lenora cruel in ways she might not have recognized as cruelty. It started small, sharp words when the evening totals didn't match expectations. Blame assigned to Rosalie for supply problems that were clearly the result of the Durango road washing out. A backhand across the face one evening when a bulk order came back wrong, though the order had been placed by Lenora herself. Then it became a pattern. The bruises on Rosalie's forearms she learned to explain as loading accidents. The mark along her jaw in October, she said she'd walked into the storeroom doorframe. People in Coldwater Ridge were not, as a general rule, stupid. They could see what was happening. They simply decided, one by one, that it was not their business, and that the Fenwick situation was complicated, and that Lenora was a widow under strain, and that Rosalie was a grown woman who could leave if she wanted to badly enough. What they did not consider, or chose not to, was that Rosalie had nowhere to go. She had no savings of her own. Lenora controlled the accounts. She had no family beyond her mother, no close friends in town. and a reputation that centered entirely on her size and her presumed unattractiveness to men, which meant the usual escape route of marriage had not presented itself. She was trapped not by locks and bars, but by circumstance, by poverty, and by the deliberate, slow removal of every option that might have let her breathe. And she kept the store running. That was the part that ate at her sometimes, late in the evenings when the customers were gone, and she was doing the final tallies by lamplight. She kept the store running. She knew the inventory by heart. She knew which suppliers could be negotiated with, and which ones would not move on price. She knew that the Hargrove family ran a tab that was 3 months past due, and that they were good for it come spring when their wool sold. And she knew that the Calverts would pay in full this week because Mrs. Calvert had mentioned her brother was visiting from Denver with coin to spare. She knew the store the way she knew her own breathing, and none of that knowledge was hers. The first morning Rourke Maddox came into the store, Rosalie thought he was lost. He had the look of a man who operated primarily in the open country-worn canvas coat, heavy work boots with trail muds, still in the creases, a hat that had been good quality about 4 years ago and had earned every crease and stain it now carried. He was around 35, broad across the shoulders, with a quiet, deliberate way of moving that didn't waste anything. He came through the door and stopped just inside it, looking at the layout of the store with the focused attention of someone who was actually looking, not just waiting for his eyes to adjust. Most customers who walked in already knew what they needed. They went straight for it. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, just orienting. Then he walked to the counter. "I need a few things," he said. "Flour, coffee, a new axe handle, mine split clean through, and whatever you've got for a bad cut on a man's hand that doesn't want to close." "How bad?" Rosalie asked. "Bad enough that he's been packing it with cloth for 2 days, and I'm worried about what's growing in it." Rosalie pulled a tin of drawing salve from the shelf behind her and set it on the counter. "This pulls, it hurts some, but it'll bring out what's in there so it can close clean." She paused. "How deep is it?" "Deep enough. You need to keep it wrapped and dry for at least a week after you use the salve. If the skin around it goes red and streaky, don't wait ride for the doctor in Jericho Flats." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way most people looked at her, measuring her size against some internal expectation and finding it worthy of private commentary. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has just said something useful. "All right," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." She rang up his items. He paid without argument, which already put him ahead of about a third of her regular customers. He folded his change into his coat pocket, picked up his goods, and was most of the way to the door when he stopped. "The axe handle," he said. "You had exactly one in the right size." "We stock 2, she said. "The other's in back. You want it?" "No, I meant how did you know what size I needed?" Rosalie looked at him. "I didn't, but you've got wide hands and you're left dominant from the way you reach. The longer handle would have been awkward for you. I would have brought you the other one if you'd needed it." He held her gaze for a beat. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "That's a useful skill," he said. "Keeps the store running," she said, and turned back to her ledger. He left. She didn't think much about it. 3 days later, he came back. He didn't need anything urgent. He bought a tin of coffee and a block of salt and spent about 4 minutes looking at the harness oil before deciding against it. But while he was there, he watched. Not rudely, not with the lingering quality of someone who has nowhere to be. He watched the way she worked, the way she moved between customers, the way she talked a rancher's wife out of a supply order that was going to go bad before she could use it, and into a smaller quantity that would serve her better. The way she noted a price discrepancy in a new shipment from the Durango supplier and corrected it in the ledger before she'd even finished talking to the customer about something else. When he came to pay, he said, "You run this place yourself." "My mother owns it," Rosalie said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment, mostly. He nodded. "Thought so." He pocketed his change and left without pushing further. The third time he came, he brought a small tin of healing salve and left it on the counter without comment. Not the commercial kind she stocked. The other kind, the sort made from lard and comfrey, and something that smelled faintly of pine. The kind that old hands made themselves, because they'd had too many injuries in too many remote places to trust anything that came in a printed label. He slid it across the counter and said, "For when the store fixtures get violent again." He said it looking directly at her, and his voice was flat and quiet, and without any particular emphasis, which was somehow worse than if he'd made a joke of it. Because it meant he'd seen the bruise along her jaw and was neither performing ignorance nor performing outrage. He was simply acknowledging it, naming it quietly, and leaving the response entirely to her. Rosalie stared at the tin. "Those go by fast," she said after a moment. "I've been considering stocking them." "Fair enough," he said, and turned toward the harness oil she'd talked him out of last time. She put the tin under the counter behind the medicine bottles. The bruises on her forearms were from 3 nights ago. Lenora had been in a fury about a supply invoice from the Durango Freight Company, a company that Silas Ketteridge had apparently started advising, though the nature of that relationship was one Rosalie had not yet been able to fully understand. The invoice had been wrong, not by accident. The numbers were inflated in small enough amounts that a person not paying close attention might not catch it an extra 2 cents per unit here, a rounding error in the wrong direction there. But Rosalie had caught it, and when she'd brought it to Lenora's attention, Lenora had accused her of trying to start a fight with their supplier. "You don't understand business," Lenora had said. "You understand numbers, but you don't understand people. I understand that we're being overcharged by $11.40 this month," Rosalie had said. That was when Lenora had grabbed her by the arm. The next morning, Rosalie had corrected the invoice anyway, sent the amended figures back to the freight company, and noted the discrepancy in her own private ledger, the one she kept hidden inside the cover of an old almanac that sat on the storeroom shelf with 14 others exactly like it. She'd been keeping that private ledger for 4 months. It had started with a feeling she couldn't shake the sense that the numbers Lenora showed her and the numbers that actually moved through the store did not quite match. Not dramatically. Nothing so obvious that she could point to it immediately. But over time, the way water finds a crack, the discrepancies had revealed themselves. The first clear thing she'd found was the size of the debt. Lenora had been telling her for over a year that Edmund Fenwick had died, owing nearly $900 to various creditors, and that this debt was the reason the store was struggling, the reason economies had to be made, the reason Rosalie should not expect wages beyond room and board, the reason every decision Lenora made was a crisis. $900 was a crushing amount. It was enough to justify fear. It was enough to explain everything. But the original banknote, the only legitimate debt Edmund had actually carried, was for $275. Rosalie had found it filed behind the wrong folder in Edmund's old tin document case. She'd been looking for a freight receipt from 3 years ago when she'd found it. She'd read it 4 times because she didn't trust the first 3 readings. Then she'd put it back in the wrong folder exactly where she'd found it and said nothing. Because she needed to understand more before she said anything. What she understood now, after 4 months of careful, secret tracking, was this. Silas Ketteridge had convinced Lenora that he was personally managing a much larger debt on the family's behalf. He had presented himself as a kind of financial guardian, someone with influence over the creditors that Lenora could not access herself. He had received money from Lenora, considerable money, steadily as repayment for debts that, as far as Rosalie could determine, did not exist. Confidence scheme, it was fraud. It was being run on a frightened widow who had already collapsed under her grief and her fear, and who trusted a man with a good suit and a confident voice, because trusting him was easier than not trusting him. And now Silas wanted Rosalie. Not because he loved her. Rosalie was clear-eyed enough to understand that a man like Silas Ketteridge did not love anyone, in the same way a freight wagon does not love the road. He wanted her because marrying Rosalie would give him a legal claim over the Fenwick estate, which included the mercantile building, the lot, and any equipment and inventory inside it. He wanted her because she was, in his assessment, someone who could be managed. A young woman with no allies and no options who would sign what she was told to sign and not cause trouble afterward. He had been wrong about that, but Rosalie was still figuring out the exact dimensions of how wrong he was. The morning Silas came in and threw the ledger on the floor, Rosalie had known it was coming. She hadn't known it would be that morning specifically, but she'd known something like it was on its way, because Silas had been in twice in the past week, and both times he'd watched her with the focused attention of someone calculating a problem. And the problem from his perspective was a young woman who was taking too long to accept an arrangement he considered already decided. He had walked in with 2 of his freight workers behind him, men who were paid to look large and say nothing, and he had crossed the floor and taken the ledger off the counter and thrown it on the planks without breaking stride. "You don't need that anymore," he said. "You're going to be my wife by Friday." Several customers in the store went very still. A woman near the flour barrels took a small step backward. 2 freight workers positioned themselves by the door in a way that was not quite blocking it, but was clearly meant to communicate a direction of movement for anyone considering leaving. Rosalie looked at the ledger on the floor. It had landed face down, and several loose pages of her evening notes had spilled out. She did not reach for it. "I don't recall agreeing to that," she said. "Your mother agreed," Silas said. "My mother doesn't own my life. She owns this store. He spread his hands, indicating the building around them. "And this store owes me a considerable amount of money. The marriage is how the debt gets settled." Rosalie kept her voice even. Her heart was hammering somewhere behind her sternum, but her voice, she'd learned a long time ago, did not have to do what her heart was doing. "What debt are you referring to specifically?" Something moved across Silas's face. Not anger, not yet. Irritation at the question. "You know what debt?" "I don't, actually. I keep these books." She nodded toward the ledger on the floor. "And I'm not aware of a debt to you of any amount." Silas's jaw tightened. "Your mother will tell you." "My mother has been telling me many things for a year," Rosalie said. "I've been having trouble reconciling them with the documents." The word documents landed in the room in a particular way. Rosalie watched Silas notice it. He stepped toward the counter. He was not a physically frightening man in the way that some large men are frightening. He didn't have the build for it, being thick rather than imposing, but he had the specific quality of someone who was used to his proximity being enough to make people agree with him. He planted both hands on the counter and leaned forward. "You're going to sign what I put in front of you," he said. "That's how this ends." "I'm not going to sign anything," Rosalie said. "You don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Not women in your position." He said it without cruelty, just fact. The way a man states something he's repeated so many times it no longer feels like a value judgment. "You've got no money, no husband, no prospects. I'm offering you a future." Most girls in your situation would be grateful. The store was utterly silent now. Rosalie could hear the wind outside and the faint creak of the sign above the door. She said, "Grateful. That's right." She looked at him for a long moment. "Pick up the ledger," she said. Silas blinked. "What?" "The ledger. You threw it on my floor. Pick it up." A beat of silence. Then Silas laughed a short, dismissive sound. He reached across the counter and grabbed Rosalie by the wrist. "We're done talking about ledgers," he said. The grip was hard. The kind meant to remind a person that their body could be controlled even if their words couldn't. Rosalie felt it all the way up her arm and into her shoulder, and for one awful second she recognized it the same quality as her mother's grip, the same message underneath it. "You don't get to decide this." Nobody in the store moved. And then the door opened. Rourke Maddox came in from the cold with snow still on his coat collar and mud on his boots, and he stopped just inside the doorway the way he always did, taking in the room, orienting. He took in the two freight workers by the door. He took in the customers pressed back against the shelves. He took in Silas leaning across the counter with his hand on Rosalie's wrist. He walked across the store at a measured pace, not fast, not slow, and stopped about 4 feet from Silas. "Let her go," he said. His voice had no particular edge to it. He wasn't performing. He just said it. Silas released Rosalie's wrist. He turned to look at Rourke, and his expression went through a quick recalculation. He didn't know this man. Rourke was nobody in Coldwater Ridge, a high-country cowboy with no ranch, no land, no standing in the town's social order. He was nobody worth considering seriously. "This doesn't concern you," Silas said. "I was talking to her," Rourke said, without looking at Silas. He looked at Rosalie. "Do you want him here?" The question was so simple it was almost strange. No speech about rights, no challenge thrown at Silas, no dramatic declaration. Just a question directed at her, as if her answer was the only one that mattered. Rosalie looked at the customers along the walls. Some of them had been coming into this store for years. Some of them had bought flour on credit when things were hard, and she had quietly carried the tab for weeks past what was reasonable, because she knew they were good people having a difficult season. Some of them had seen the bruise on her jaw in October and not said a word. She looked at the ledger pages on the floor. "No," she said. Rourke turned to Silas. "You heard her." Silas's face went red in the way that faces go red when someone accustomed to authority encounters an unexpected refusal from a direction they had dismissed. "Her mother and I have an arrangement." "She said no," Rourke said, "about you in her store." "I think that's the end of this conversation. You have no idea what you're stepping into." "Probably not," Rourke agreed. He said it pleasantly, as if Silas had just commented on the weather. She said no. One of the freight workers near the door shifted his weight. Rourke glanced at him briefly and then back at Silas. "Your men are blocking the door," Rourke said. "Move them back." A long suspended moment. Silas measured it, measured Rourke, measured the room, measured what moving his men back would cost him in terms of the authority he'd walked in carrying. He nodded slightly. The freight workers stepped away from the door. "This isn't finished," Silas said to Rosalie. His voice had changed quality. The certainty was still there, but it was harder now, with something underneath it that was close to anger and not quite. "Your mother has already agreed. The law is going to agree. And whatever this man thinks he's doing," he glanced at Rourke, "it's not going to change what happens next." He turned and walked to the door. The freight workers followed. When the door closed, the sound of it was very loud in the quiet store. Nobody moved for a moment. Then a woman near the back released a breath she'd clearly been holding, and the small sound of it broke something loose in the room, and people began quietly, carefully going back to what they'd been doing before, as though they could return to normal by pretending the last 4 minutes had simply not occurred. Rourke bent down and picked up the ledger. He gathered the loose pages carefully, set them in order by what he could see of the headings, and placed the whole thing back on the counter. "Thank you," Rosalie said. "You'd already handled it," he said. She looked at him. He had my wrist. "You weren't backing down," he said it simply. Not as a compliment, just as observation. "You want me to go?" Rosalie looked at the door. Through the front window, she could see Silas and his men moving down the main road, Silas talking, one of the men nodding. She looked back at the ledger. "No," she said. "Stay a while. I need to recount the morning's totals. The disturbance threw my numbers off." Rourke found a chair near the window and sat in it, and he kept watch on the street while Rosalie went back to work. She did not let herself think about what Silas had said. Not yet. She ran the totals, found where she'd lost her place, recalculated from the last clean number. The pencil moved across the columns, the numbers aligned. The word he'd said kept sitting at the edge of her thinking. Grateful. She thought about what she actually had to be grateful for, in the cold light of an honest accounting. A store that she ran but did not own, a debt that did not exist. A mother who had used fear as an excuse to do things that should not be excused. Years of bruises that a whole town had decided were not their business. She thought about the private ledger in the almanac on the storeroom shelf. She thought about the banknote for $275. She picked up her pencil. She was going to need more paper. And she was going to need someone who could ride to Durango and find a territorial attorney. She looked at Rourke, sitting in the chair by the window. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He turned from the window. "Go ahead. Do you know anyone in Durango? A lawyer type." "Someone honest." He considered this. "I know of a man named Whitlock. Amos Whitlock. He does territorial law, works out of an office above the feed store on Canyon Road. I've never hired him personally, but the man who told me about him said he was the kind of lawyer who actually read what he signed." "That's a specific quality to mention," Rosalie said. "It's rarer than it should be," Rourke said. Rosalie wrote the name in the margin of the current page. "Amos Whitlock, Durango, Canyon Road. What are you thinking?" Rourke asked. She tapped the pencil against the ledger. "I'm thinking Silas Ketteridge made a mistake this morning." "What mistake?" She looked up. "He threw my books on the floor," she said. "And now I'm going to use them to take everything from him." Outside, the winter wind picked up, and the sign above the door groaned on its fittings, and Coldwater Ridge went about its business the way it always had, looking the other direction, minding itself, pretending the hard things happening inside the Fenwick store were someone else's problem. But Rosalie Fenwick was done pretending. She pulled the ledger close, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. Rosalie worked until the lamp oil ran low. She had sent the last customer out at 5:30, turned the sign on the door, and gone straight to the storeroom. Not to close up, not to eat, though she hadn't eaten since the heel of bread she'd had at 6 that morning. She went to the storeroom because the almanac was there, on the third shelf from the bottom, tucked between two others of the same size and color, and inside the front cover of that almanac was the private ledger she'd been keeping for 4 months. She spread it on the crate she used as a work surface and set the lamp close. Rourke had left shortly before closing. He hadn't made a production of it, just stood, put his hat on, said he'd be back in the morning to check on a few things, and walked out. He didn't say what things. She didn't ask. She found that she was glad for the straightforwardness of it, the absence of any ceremony. He hadn't rescued her, and he wasn't going to behave as though he had. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. What she had on the crate in front of her was 4 months of double entry tracking. Every amount Lenora had paid to Silas Ketteridge, recorded from the cash box withdrawals and from the freight invoice irregularities she'd caught and written down before Lenora could see. Every inflated supplier charge from the Durango Freight Company. Every month that the store's actual receipts did not reconcile with the figures Lenora presented as the total operating picture. It was, taken together, a record of a system. And systems, Rosalie had learned, always revealed themselves eventually if you were patient enough and kept your numbers clean. The legitimate banknote, Edmund Fenwick's only real debt, was $275, taken against the store building in 1,879. The note carried a 4-year repayment term at standard interest. By her calculation, accounting for what Edmund had paid back before his death and what the store had earned since, the remaining balance on that note was somewhere between $40 and $60. depending on how the interest had accrued in the final year. $40 to $60, not $900. Not the crushing weight her mother had been carrying around for 3 years as the justification for everything, for the fear, for the decisions, for Silas. She sat with that number for a while, in the lamplight. Then she turned to a fresh page and began writing the summary she would need if she was ever going to make an attorney understand what she'd found fast enough to matter. She was still writing when she heard Lenora come in through the back. Her mother had been at the Hanover house for most of the afternoon. Rosalie had not asked why, but she suspected it had something to do with the meeting between Silas and the church deacons that she'd overheard being planned last week. Lenora came through the storeroom door and stopped when she saw Rosalie at the crate with the ledger and the lamp. "What are you doing?" Lenora said. "Accounts," Rosalie said. At this hour, the morning got disrupted. Lenora moved further into the room. She was a tall woman, spare through the frame now in a way she hadn't been when Edmund was alive, with gray threading her brown hair and a permanent set to her mouth that had arrived after the funeral and never left. She looked at the papers spread around Rosalie's workspace with the particular attention of someone who was trying to determine whether they should be worried. "Silas came to see me this afternoon," Lenora said. Rosalie kept writing. "He said there was an incident at the store." "He grabbed my wrist," Rosalie said, "in front of 6 customers. A pause. "He said you refused to discuss the arrangement." "I refuse to agree to a marriage I haven't agreed to." Rosalie set down her pencil and looked at her mother. "Mama, I need you to listen to me carefully, Rosalie. I need you to listen." She turned the private ledger so Lenora could see the columns. "Sit down." Lenora did not sit. She stood with her arms folded in the specific posture that meant she had already decided what the conversation was going to be about and had already formulated her response to it. "The debt you've been paying Silas," Rosalie said. "How much do you think we owe him?" He explained the figures to me. "How much, Mama?" Lenora's jaw tightened. "It's complex. It involves multiple parties and the freight arrangement and the—" "Is it close to $900? Silence. "Because Papa's banknote," Rosalie said, "was $275. I found it. It's in the document case behind the folder with the 49 supplier receipts. The remaining balance on that note, at the time Papa died, was somewhere around $200. Everything we've paid since his death, beyond what the note required, all of it has gone somewhere that isn't paying down a legitimate debt." Lenora unfolded her arms, then folded them again. "Silas has connections to the creditors that we don't. There are no other creditors." Rosalie said it as gently as she could, which wasn't very gentle because she was tired and her wrist still ached, and she had been holding this information alone for 4 months. "Papa didn't owe money beyond that note. I have looked. I have looked at every document in that case, and I have checked the county records through the post office, and there is nothing. Silas invented the debt, Mama. He invented it, and you believed him because you were frightened, and he told you he could protect us from it. And now he wants the store as repayment for a bill that was never real." Lenora's face went through several things in quick succession. Rosalie watched them move across her mother's features like weather disbelief, then something that was almost recognition, then the hard defensive expression that had become her mother's default response to anything she didn't want to be true. "You don't understand how these arrangements work," Lenora said. "I understand numbers," Rosalie said. "I understand what's in these books. You're 21 years old. I run this store." Rosalie's voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it. "I have run it for 3 years. I know every account, every supplier, every family in this valley that owes us money and every debt we legitimately carry. I am telling you that what Silas has been telling you is not real. And I need to know if you believe me." The lamp flickered. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in the street. Lenora said very quietly, "He has documents." "So do I," Rosalie said, "and mine match the county records." Another silence, longer this time. Rosalie watched her mother's face and tried to find in it the woman who had once been capable and steady, who had run the house and kept the family organized and known every neighbor's name. That woman was still somewhere in there. She'd just been buried under 3 years of fear and poor decisions, and the particular paralysis that comes from trusting the wrong person too deeply to admit the mistake. "If you're wrong," Lenora said slowly, "and Silas finds out you've been looking into his business." "I know what the risk is," Rosalie said. "Do you?" Lenora's voice had a sharp edge to it now, and Rosalie recognized it and braced herself. "You think that cowboy who came into the store today is going to protect you? You think one man standing between you and Silas is going to mean anything? Silas has freight contracts with half the valley. He controls what comes into this town and what doesn't. If he decides we're enemies, we're already not his friends," Rosalie said. "We're his target. There's a difference." Lenora said nothing. "I'm going to write to an attorney in Durango," Rosalie said. "His name is Amos Whitlock. I'm going to send him a summary of what I've found and ask him what our options are. Without telling Silas. Obviously without telling Silas. Lenora looked at the papers on the crate. Her expression was unreadable in the way that faces sometimes are when they're working through something that is both obvious and devastating in equal measure. And the marriage arrangement. There is no arrangement, Rosalie said. Not one I've agreed to, and I won't. Rosalie. Lenora sat down now heavily on the other crate across from her daughter. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the floor for a moment before looking back up. You have to understand why I didn't know what else to do. Father died. Silas came and said he could manage things, and I was so tired, and I know, Rosalie said. I didn't mean for it. I know, Mama. She did know. That was the complicated part, the part that kept her up at night sometimes more than the bruises did. She knew exactly how it had happened. She'd watched it happen, step by step, over 3 years. But now we have to fix it. Lenora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, What do you need me to do? It was not an apology. Rosalie hadn't expected one, but it was something a door opening a crack, just enough to let a little light through. Don't tell Silas I've been looking at the accounts, Rosalie said. Don't tell him about the attorney, and don't agree to anything else without talking to me first. Lenora nodded once. Rosalie picked up her pencil and went back to work. She did not sleep well that night. In the morning, Rourke was back before the store opened, as he'd said he would be. He arrived with a bucket of nails from his saddlebag and spent 30 minutes replacing the worst of the porch boards without being asked, because apparently he'd noticed they were bad. Rosalie watched him through the window while she sorted the morning's inventory and tried to decide how much to tell him. She decided to tell him most of it. When he came inside and poured himself a coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove in the corner, she walked him through what she had. The banknote, the inflated freight invoices, the payments to Silas that exceeded any legitimate debt by a wide margin. She laid it out plainly, without drama, the way she'd have presented a set of figures to anyone who needed to understand them. Rourke listened without interrupting. He held his coffee with both hands and looked at the papers she spread on the counter and asked one question when she finished. How long have you been tracking this alone? 4 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you should have had someone watching your back from the start. You have someone now. He said it without any particular weight to it. Not a declaration, not a promise, just a fact he was putting in front of her, the same way he'd put the salve tin on the counter. Quiet and direct and requiring nothing from her in response. What do you need? I need someone to ride to Durango, she said. Not a letter. Letters take too long, and there's a chance Silas has influence at the post office. I need someone to go in person and find Amos Whitlock on Canyon Road and give him this. She held up a folded paper. And I need it done quietly before Silas hears anything about it. I can do that, Rourke said. It's a 2-day ride. I know where Durango is. She handed him the paper. He folded it and put it inside his coat. There's one other thing, Rosalie said. He waited. I think Silas's scheme isn't just us, she said carefully. I think we're one of several. The inflated freight invoices, the invented debt, the pressure toward property transfer, it's too practiced. He's done this before. He knows exactly when to apply pressure and when to back off and what kind of fear works on what kind of person. She paused. If Whitlock is going to do anything that actually sticks, he's going to need more than our accounts. He's going to need other families. Rourke considered this. That's a harder ask. People in this valley have been keeping their troubles to themselves. Getting them to talk to a lawyer in a formal proceeding that's going to take something. I know that too. She looked at him, but right now I don't have the leverage for anything else. So we start with Whitlock and we see what he says. Rourke stood. He pulled his coat straight and put his hat on. I'll leave within the hour. Be back late day after tomorrow at the earliest. Rourke, she said. He stopped. Be careful who sees you leave, she said it matter-of-factly. Silas's freight workers come through twice a day on the North Road. They see you heading toward Durango with a purpose. I'll take the river route, he said, longer but less visible. She nodded. He left through the back. Rosalie turned to her morning accounts and tried not to think about what happened if Silas discovered what she was doing before Whitlock could get involved. She tried, and she managed it mostly by keeping her pencil moving and her attention on the numbers in front of her, because numbers did not lie to her, and numbers did not grab her wrist, and numbers did not make her afraid. The day passed. The second day was harder. Silas came in that afternoon. He didn't throw anything this time. He came in quietly, with just one freight worker behind him, and he browsed the dry goods shelves with a leisurely quality that was somehow worse than his aggressive entrance 2 days before, because the leisure was deliberate. He was showing her he could afford to take his time. He picked up a tin of peaches and looked at the price on the label. You marking these up? He said pleasantly. Standard margin, Rosalie said. Seems high. The Durango freight rate went up, she said. As I'm sure you know, he set the tin down and moved along the shelf. Where's your cowboy friend? I don't know what you mean. The man who thought he had something to say the other day. He said it conversationally, not aggressively. Haven't seen him around. People come and go, Rosalie said. Silas moved to the counter. He rested one elbow on it casual, the way a man rests at a bar when he's in no hurry and wants everyone around him to know it. He looked at her directly. I want you to understand something, he said. I don't have any personal interest in making this difficult for you. You're a young woman in a hard situation. I'm offering a solution. That's all. I appreciate the framing, Rosalie said. Something moved in his eyes. She caught it and filed it away. He didn't like her vocabulary. He'd expected less of it. Your mother and I have an understanding, he said. A legal arrangement. It doesn't require your enthusiasm to be valid. I'm 21, Rosalie said. In the territory of Colorado, a woman of 21 is not required to accept a marriage arranged by a parent. I've checked. She hadn't checked from a legal document. She'd checked from a conversation she'd had with schoolteacher Irene Bellamy 6 weeks ago, when she'd started to sense what was coming and had begun asking careful questions of careful people. But Silas didn't need to know the source. You've checked, he repeated. I have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened and adjusted his coat and picked up the tin of peaches again. I'll take these, he said, and a pound of coffee. He paid. He always paid. She'd noticed, in full and on time, because it was important to him to appear legitimate in small commercial transactions while operating fraudulently in large ones. At the door he paused. Rosalie, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name without the title attached, and it was deliberate, a small reminder that he considered himself already within the range of that familiarity. The arrangement stands. Your mother's agreement is recorded. Whatever you think you've found in those books of yours, don't make it into something you can't walk back from. He left. Rosalie stood very still behind the counter for about 30 seconds. Then she turned, went to the storeroom, pulled the almanac off the shelf, and sat on the floor with her back against the shelving and the private ledger in her lap. He'd said, whatever you think you've found in those books. He knew she'd been looking. She didn't know how he knew whether Lenora had said something, whether one of his freight workers had seen something through the window, whether he was simply smart enough to have anticipated it. But he knew, and he'd just told her he knew without telling her directly so she couldn't be certain. That was how he operated. She pulled her knees up and pressed the ledger against her chest and breathed for a moment. Then she got up, put the almanac back on the shelf, and went back to the counter, because the store didn't close itself. When Rourke returned, he came back in the late afternoon of the second day, trail-tired, and still wearing the mud of the river route, and he came through the back again and sat down on the crate in the storeroom without ceremony. Whitlock's a careful man, he said. Is that good or bad? Rosalie said. Good. He doesn't move fast, but he doesn't move wrong either. He looked at the summary you sent, and he asked for the original documents. Rourke reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. He wrote this. He said, read it carefully. Rosalie read it. Whitlock was not encouraging in a comfortable way. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. What he told her was that what she'd described, if the documents supported it, constituted a pattern of fraud that was prosecutable at the territorial level, but that a single ledger kept by an interested party would not be enough. He needed the original banknote. He needed the freight invoices with the inflated figures. He needed ideally testimony from at least one other affected party. And he needed Rosalie to understand that once she filed a formal complaint, Silas Ketteridge would know about it within days, and whatever leverage he hadn't yet used would come into play. She read it twice, then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. He needs originals, she said. Can you get them? The banknote is in the document case. The freight invoices are in the account files. I've been keeping the originals separate from the working copies since I started noticing the discrepancies. She paused. Getting them out without Mama noticing is the harder problem. What's the easier problem? Finding another affected family. She leaned against the storeroom shelf. I think the Aldermans. Their freight costs went up significantly last spring, and I remember Vera Alderman mentioning it and looking like she wanted to say more than she said. And there was something about the Greer property I heard at the post office that the Greers had signed a new freight contract with Silas's company about 8 months ago under what sounded like pressure, but nobody said it directly. I know the Aldermans slightly, Rourke said. I did some fence work for them 2 summers back. Martin Alderman is cautious, but he's not a man who likes being taken advantage of. If he understood what was happening, the problem is that understanding it and being willing to say so to an attorney are 2 different things, Rosalie said. If Silas freezes their freight access while this is being investigated, the aldermans could lose a season.
Yeah.
Rourke rubbed the back of his neck. So we'd be asking them to take a risk. We'd be asking them to take the same risk I'm already taking, she said. Except they'd have backup now. There's a difference between one person going against Silas and several. Rourke looked at her. You're thinking about this like a campaign. I'm thinking about it like an accounting problem, she said. Assets, liabilities, risk. Right now our biggest liability is isolation. If we can reduce that, you want me to talk to Alderman. She met his eyes. Would you? He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant thinking. Give me a few days. I need to approach it right. If I walk up to Martin Alderman and start talking about legal proceedings against Silas Ketteridge before he's warmed to the idea, he'll shut the door. I know, she said. Be careful about it. I will be. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. Rosalie could hear the wind picking up outside, and the distant sound of the main road settling into evening, fewer horses, fewer voices, the town turning inward the way it did after dark. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. Why are you doing this? He looked at her with the direct, unhurried quality she'd started to recognize as simply how he looked at things. You mean, why am I involved? You had no reason to be. You weren't a regular customer. You didn't know me. You walked into a store and saw something that didn't concern you, and you've been coming back ever since, and now you're riding to Durango on an errand for a woman you met 10 days ago. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands once, the way he did when he was considering something carefully. My mother ran a trading post, he said, up in the high country, past the Animas River. Small operation, just her and my uncle after my father left. She was a capable woman. Kept the books herself, handled the suppliers, knew every family in a 2-day radius. He stopped. When I was about 12, a man came through, convincing type. Said he could improve their freight arrangement, get them better supply prices. My mother trusted him because he was confident, and she was tired, and confidence can look like competence if you're not careful. He looked at his hat. She lost the post. By the time anyone understood what had happened, there was nothing left to fight for. Rosalie didn't say she was sorry. The moment felt too old for that. Nobody stepped in, he said. It wasn't accusatory. Just factual. Plenty of people who could have. Nobody did. So I'm not doing this because you remind me of my mother, he said. A little sharper, cutting off the easy interpretation. I'm doing it because I was 12 years old and I didn't understand what was happening, and by the time I did, I couldn't do anything. I'm not 12 now. He put his hat on. The other thing, he said, and his voice had gone back to its usual even quality, is that you're the sharpest person I've met in 3 years of territory work. And watching somebody sharp get buried under a scheme they've already figured out just because they don't have anyone to stand with them. He shrugged. Bothers me. Rosalie looked at him for a moment. That's a very practical reason, she said. I'm a practical man. She almost smiled. All right, talk to the aldermans. Be careful. You keep saying that. You keep needing to hear it. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, and then he was gone through the back door. Rosalie turned back to the storeroom. She looked at the almanac on the shelf. She thought about the documents she needed to copy, and the originals she needed to get to Whitlock, and the other families she hadn't yet identified, and the way Silas had said, whatever you think you found in. Those books, like he already knew she'd been in them. She thought about how much time she had before he decided to stop being careful himself. Not much. She pulled the almanac off the shelf and opened the front cover. There was a name that had come to her during Rourke's ride, someone she hadn't considered yet as a potential ally, because the person operated so quietly in Coldwater Ridge that it was easy to forget she had opinions at all. Irene Bellamy taught at the one-room school 2 blocks from the mercantile. She was a small, precise woman in her mid-30s, unmarried, with the specific quiet of someone who has learned that the best way to keep her position is to never make herself the story. But she came into Fenwick Mercantile twice a week, and she always paid cash, and she always said exactly what she needed without any social padding, and her eyes were the kind that noticed things. Last autumn, Irene had come in for chalk and a bolt of navy fabric, and had stood at the counter while Rosalie wrote up the total, and she'd said, very quietly, without preamble, you know you don't have to stay. Rosalie had said, I have nowhere to go. And Irene had said, in a way that meant she didn't entirely accept that answer. And then she'd taken her chalk and her fabric and left. Rosalie had thought about that many times since. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the stack beside the crate and wrote a short note. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket alongside Whitlock's letter. In the morning, she would drop it at the school on the way to open the store. She would not ask Irene for much, not yet, just whether she'd be willing to listen. That was the thing about building something solid. You had to start with what you had. You couldn't wait until you had everything. You started with the available materials, in the available conditions, and you built carefully, and you checked your work, and eventually you had something that could hold weight. Rosalie understood that. She'd been holding up a failing store with nothing but honest arithmetic and sheer determination for 3 years. She could hold up a legal case against Silas Ketteridge. What she needed was enough time to build it right. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs in the dark, moving through the familiar layout of the back staircase without needing to see it, because she knew every step, every creak, every place the wood had settled differently over the years. She knew this building, she knew these accounts, and tomorrow she was going to start making sure the right people knew it too. Irene Bellamy read the note twice, folded it in half, and put it in her desk drawer underneath the attendance register. She said nothing about it that day, or the next. Rosalie didn't push. She'd learned early that pushing people toward courage before they were ready only produced the appearance of courage, which was a different and far more fragile thing. Real courage had to come from inside a person's own reckoning. All you could do was give them something solid to reckon with. On the third morning, Irene came into the mercantile before school hours, when the store was empty and the coffee was still brewing on the corner stove. She took off her coat, hung it on the peg near the door the way a person does when they intend to stay a while, and sat down on the customer chair beside the counter. "Show me what you have," she said. Rosalie showed her. She spread the private ledger on the counter and walked Irene through it the same way she'd walked Rourke through it, plainly, without embellishment, letting the numbers do the work. The original banknote, the inflated freight invoices, the payments to Silas that corresponded to no legitimate obligation, the 4 months of parallel tracking that documented the gap between what Lenora believed and what the actual accounts showed. Irene sat very still through all of it. She was the kind of person who became more rather than less quiet as something troubled her, so by the end she was almost completely motionless, her hands folded on the counter and her eyes on the last page of the summary. "How many other families do you think he's done this to?" she said. "At least 2 that I can identify from indirect evidence," Rosalie said. "Probably more. The Aldermans, yes, and the Greers." "You know about the Greers?" Irene looked up. "Clara Greer is one of my students' mothers. She mentioned the freight contract situation to me last spring in a way that made it clear she was frightened but didn't know how to say it directly. I didn't understand the full picture then." She paused. "I do now," Rosalie said. "Irene, I need you to understand what it means if this moves forward. Silas controls the freight supply into this valley. If he decides to make an example, I know what it means." Irene said it firmly but without heat. "I've been teaching in this town for 7 years. I know what it costs to be the person who says the thing nobody wants to hear." She unfolded her hands and pressed them flat on the counter. "I also know what it costs to stay quiet. I've been paying that for a long time." Something about the way she said it made Rosalie pause. "Is there something specific?" "There's always something specific." Irene stood and straightened her coat. "When can your attorney be here?" "Rourke is riding back to Durango today to ask Whitlock to come in person. The documents we have should be enough to start a formal review. But Whitlock said he needs testimony from someone beyond the immediate family. Someone who can speak to what they witnessed or experienced independently." "I can do that," Irene said. "I'm not a party to any financial arrangement with Silas. My testimony is clean. Are you certain?" Irene gave her a look that was on the short side of patient. "I said I can do it." Rosalie nodded. "Then we wait for Whitlock." Irene picked up her coat. At the door she stopped and said, without turning, "You should know that Mrs. Hargrove mentioned something to me at the post office last week about her husband's account with the freight company." She stopped herself before she said much, but the look on her face, she turned just enough to glance back. "People are more ready than you think. They just need to know someone started already." She left. Rosalie stood behind the counter in the quiet store and let that settle. "People are more ready than you think." She wrote it down on the margin of the current ledger page because she had a habit of writing things down that mattered, and then she went back to the accounts. The week that followed had a particular stretched quality, the kind that comes when several things are moving at once and you cannot see where any of them will land. Rourke rode back to Durango and sent word through a rancher he trusted that Whitlock would come within 10 days if the documents warranted it. Rosalie spent her evenings copying the most critical records into a second set that she hid separately from the originals, because if Silas's people found one cache, she wanted another intact. She moved the original banknote out of the document case and into a different location entirely, tucked between the pages of the store's oldest inventory register, where nobody but Rosalie would think to look. Lenora watched all of this with a face like someone standing at the edge of a river trying to decide whether the current was safe to cross. She didn't interfere. She didn't help. She moved through the store and the back rooms with the slightly underwater quality she'd had for 3 years. And she sometimes looked at Rosalie's work spread across the counter with an expression that could have been shame or could have been fear or was probably both. One evening she came into the storeroom while Rosalie was organizing the document copies and said, "He came to see me today." Rosalie looked up. "Silas. He asked if you'd been to Durango recently, or sent anyone. What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." Lenora paused. "That's true. I don't know exactly what you've sent or to whom." "Good. That's the right answer, Rosalie." Lenora sat on the crate. She looked older tonight than Rosalie had seen her look in a while, or maybe she was just seeing it more clearly. He said, "If this doesn't get resolved cleanly, there could be difficulties with the supply route." He said it the way he says things that aren't quite threats. "Because they're not threats," Rosalie said. "They're promises with deniability built in." Lenora rubbed her hands together, a nervous habit she'd developed in the past year. What happens if the attorney can't do anything in time? What happens if Silas cuts us off from the Durango supply before there's any legal protection in place? It was a fair question. Rosalie had been asking it to herself every night. "We've got 6 weeks of core inventory," she said. "I've been building the stock gradually for 2 months without making it obvious. Coffee, flour, salt, medical supplies. The things people need most." She met her mother's eyes. "And I've been in contact with a supplier in Pueblo who operates independently of Silas's freight network. Prices are slightly higher, and the route takes longer, but it's viable." Lenora blinked. "When did you, last month?" "Through a letter I sent by way of the Alderman Ranch, not through the post office here." She watched her mother's face. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Mama." Lenora was quiet. Then softly, "You've been doing all of this alone." Between them, not accusatory. "Just true." Lenora looked at the floor. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's not enough." Rosalie turned back to the papers. "It's a start," she said. It wasn't a warm answer. But it was an honest one, and right now honest was the best she could manage. The situation shifted the following Tuesday, in a way Rosalie had hoped for but hadn't been confident would come. Martin Alderman walked into Fenwick Mercantile at 9:30 in the morning, and he walked in the way a man does when he's decided something with a set to his shoulders and a directness to his path through the store that meant he wasn't browsing. He was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s, taciturn in the way that long winters in difficult land make people taciturn, and he had a reputation in Coldwater Ridge for being the sort of person who thought carefully and said little and did not waste words on complaints that weren't going anywhere productive. He came to the counter and looked at Rosalie for a moment. "Your man came to see me," he said. "Rourke isn't my man," she said. "He's someone who's been helping." Alderman accepted this with a short nod. He said, "You've been building a case against Ketteridge. Freight fraud, false debt. I've been documenting what I've found, yes. And you've got an attorney coming. Whitlock from Durango." Within the week, hopefully. Alderman put both hands on the counter. He had working man's hands, scarred across the knuckles from years of wire and fence post, and the general violence that ranching does to a person's body. He looked at them for a moment, then back at Rosalie. 2 years ago, he said, Ketteridge told me I owed his freight company a balance that didn't match my records. When I pushed back, my spring supply order arrived 3 weeks late. Missed the planting window for my west field." He paused. "Cost me about $200 that season. I couldn't prove it was deliberate." "It was deliberate," Rosalie said. "I know that." His voice was flat. "I knew it then. I didn't know how to fight it." He lifted his eyes to hers. "What do you need from me?" Rosalie held his gaze. "A signed account of what happened. Dates, amounts, the name of whoever represented Silas in the transaction. And your willingness to repeat it to Whitlock in person." Alderman was silent for several seconds, long enough that Rosalie started to think he'd recalculated the risk. Then he said, "My wife thinks we should stay out of it." "That's a reasonable position, I know." He straightened. "I'm not a reasonable man when someone costs me $200 and smiles about it." He held out his hand. "You got paper? I'll write it now while I'm in the mood." Rosalie put paper on the counter. He wrote for 12 minutes, slowly and with care, and when he was done, he'd filled both sides of 2 sheets. He dated and signed it and pushed it toward her. "There are others," he said while Rosalie read. "Hanson over near Pecos Creek, and I think the widow Greer, though she won't admit it easily. And there's a man named Croft who sold his property last year under what I always thought was suspicious pressure, but he's moved to New Mexico now." "Croft's name is useful even if he's not here," Rosalie said. "For pattern evidence," Alderman said. She looked up. He said it like someone who had thought about this. Exactly. He put his hat back on. I'll bring Vera around to Whitlock when he comes. She's more persuasive than I am when she's angry enough. Thank you, Mr. Alderman. Don't thank me, he said. Just make sure it works. He left. Rosalie read his account through twice. It was exactly what it needed to be factual, specific, dated, with amounts and names that matched the pattern she'd identified in her own tracking. She added it to the document cache in the second almanac and stood in the storeroom for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the shelf. It was real now. It had been real before in her own records, but her own records could be dismissed as the work of an interested party. Martin Alderman had nothing to gain from lying, and a man like him would be difficult to dismiss. She allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that felt like relief. Then she heard the front door of the store open and went back to work. The next 4 days moved faster than the previous ones, which was both reassuring and frightening, because things moving fast meant there was less time to catch mistakes. Rourke returned from Durango with word that Whitlock would arrive by Thursday, traveling quietly and not advertising his destination. Rosalie spent 2 evenings organizing the full document package originals, copies, Alderman's account, her own summary, the corrected banknote into a sequence that would allow Whitlock to follow the fraud from beginning to present in the shortest possible reading time. Because a busy attorney's attention was a limited resource, and she didn't intend to waste any of it. She also went to see Clara Greer. Clara was a woman of about 40, small and quick-moving, with the particular exhausted energy of someone who was working too hard and sleeping too little. She lived on the east edge of town in a house that needed painting and contained 2 children under 10 and a freight contract that Rosalie now understood had been obtained through coercion following her husband's death 18 months ago. Clara let Rosalie in, but didn't offer coffee, which told Rosalie the conversation was going to be short one way or another. "I heard you've been asking questions," Clara said. She stood in her kitchen with her arms folded. "I've been finding answers mostly," Rosalie said. "To questions I started asking on my own, about Ketteridge." Clara looked out the window. Her jaw was set. "I have children," she said. "I know. If this goes wrong, if he cuts my freight access or calls in the contract terms, I lose more than a season. I lose the house. I know that too," Rosalie said. She kept her voice steady and didn't try to minimize it, because minimizing it would have been dishonest, and Clara Greer deserved honesty. "I can't promise you it doesn't cost anything. I can only tell you what I have and what an attorney is coming to look at, and that you're not as alone in this as Silas has needed you to believe." A silence. The wind moved outside the kitchen window, and one of the children called from another room, and Clara answered without looking away from the window. "He sent a man out here last month," Clara said quietly. "Said the freight contract had a clause I'd missed. Said I owed an additional fee for the past year's service." The amount he named, she stopped. "I don't have it. I told him I needed time, and he said I had until spring." "Do you have your copy of the contract?" Rosalie asked. "Yes. Can I see the clause he mentioned?" Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she went into the next room and came back with a folded document. Rosalie read it. She read it twice. She looked up. "There's no such clause," she said. Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet, but her expression was steady. "I knew it," she said. "I knew when he said it. I just didn't know how to." "You don't have to know how to fight it alone," Rosalie said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." Clara looked at the contract in Rosalie's hand. "What do you need?" "A statement. Same as what Martin Alderman gave me. Dates, amounts, what was said, and by whom. And Whitlock may want to speak with you directly." "Whitlock," Clara said, "the territorial attorney."
"Yes."
Clara was quiet for a moment. "Then if I do this, if it doesn't work, then you're in the same position you're already in," Rosalie said. "Except you'll have tried. It was blunt." Clara seemed to need it blunt. "All right," she said. "Give me paper." Rosalie left Clara Greer's house 40 minutes later with a signed account that was, if anything, more detailed than Alderman's. Clara had a specific memory for conversations, and had apparently been replaying the coercive exchange with Silas's man in her head for weeks. She'd written down things Rosalie hadn't expected: names of the specific freight workers who'd accompanied the collector, the precise language used when the false clause was cited, the date and hour of a follow-up visit that was clearly meant as intimidation. The picture it added to the growing case was not subtle. Silas Ketteridge had not been careless. He'd been methodical and patient, and he'd operated on the assumption that frightened people don't compare notes. They keep their fear to themselves, because shame and fear are private, and they don't know that the person in the next property over is carrying the exact same weight. He'd been right about that until now. Whitlock arrived on Thursday as promised. He came in a plain buckboard with a driver Rosalie didn't recognize, not a Coldwater Ridge man, and he went directly to the hotel on the north end of the main road under a name that was not his own, which Rourke had arranged. Rosalie met him there that evening, in the small room the hotel used for private meetings, which was just a back parlor with 2 chairs and a table and a lamp. Whitlock was a compact man in his 50s, with the kind of unhurried manner that comes from spending decades in rooms where panic makes things worse. He had reading spectacles and a worn leather case, and he shook Rosalie's hand the way he would have shaken a colleague's, without any of the particular adjustment that men sometimes made when they were surprised by a woman presenting them with a legal problem. She spread the documents on the table. He read for a long time. He did not speak. He made occasional small marks in a notebook he'd brought, not in the margins of her document, she noticed, which told her he understood. These were originals, and treated them accordingly. When he finished, he took off his spectacles and set them on the table. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "this is a remarkably clean evidentiary record for something assembled under these conditions." "I've been keeping books since I was 14, she said. "I can see that." He tapped the corner of the stack. "Core fraud is clear and documentable false debt creation, fraudulent collection, coerced contract terms. What you have from Alderman and Greer establishes the pattern beyond individual dispute. That matters significantly." He paused. "What it doesn't give me yet is enough for a criminal proceeding. A civil action to recover payments and void the fraudulent contracts, yes. We could file that within the week. A territorial injunction to freeze his freight operations during investigation, that's possible if we can get a sympathetic judge, and I know who to ask." "What does it not give you?" Rosalie asked. Whitlock looked at her. "The marriage arrangement document. If there's a written contract between your mother and Ketteridge—" "There is," Rosalie said. "I haven't been able to get to it. He has his copy and my mother has hers, and my mother's is stored somewhere I haven't been able to locate. I need to see it. If it was signed under duress, or if it contains false representations about the debt as consideration for the arrangement, that document alone could be enough to extend the fraud charges into coercion territory." He folded his hands. "Can your mother be persuaded to produce it?" Rosalie thought about the conversation in the storeroom, about Lenora's face when Rosalie had spread the ledger on the crate, about the 2 words her mother had managed, "I'm sorry." "She might be," she said carefully, "if she understands what it means. She needs to understand that her cooperation now, and her willingness to testify that the arrangement was made under false pretenses, significantly affects how the court views her own role in this." He said it gently but without softening the substance. "She accepted payments from a fraudulent scheme. That's complicated. But it's less complicated if she's a victim cooperating with investigators than if she's a party who has to be compelled." "I'll talk to her tonight," Rosalie said. "Good." He picked up his spectacles. "There's one more thing I need to raise." Rosalie waited. "Ketteridge is going to know something is happening soon, if he doesn't already. A man who runs a scheme like this doesn't do it without staying alert to threats. If he moves to destroy documents before we can get a judge's order—" "I've already made 2 copies of everything I have," Rosalie said. "The originals are in 3 different locations." Whitlock paused. Then he almost smiled. "Of course you have." He stood and extended his hand again. "I'll draft the civil filing tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'd like to meet with Alderman and Greer. And tomorrow evening, if you can arrange it, your mother, and whatever she can tell me about the marriage contract." "I'll arrange it," Rosalie said. She shook his hand and left the hotel by the side entrance. The night air hit her cold and clean after the enclosed warmth of the parlor, and she stood on the side street for a moment and looked at the stars, which were sharp and numerous the way they got in the high country winter when the clouds cleared. She let herself breathe for a moment, actually breathe, the first time in days she'd allowed it. Then she heard boots on the main road, not unusual. Men moved at night in Coldwater Ridge for any number of reasons. But something about the pace of these boots, unhurried, measured, moving toward the hotel rather than past, it made her step back into the shadow of the building's corner. 2 men, she recognized one of them from Silas's freight operation, a broad man named Decker who she'd seen around town. The other she didn't know. They stopped in front of the hotel, and one of them looked at the building for a moment, then they moved on. Maybe nothing. Maybe they'd been told to watch. She waited until they'd turned the far corner, then walked home by the back alleys, moving quick and quiet through the dark. Conversation with Lenora that night was the hardest one yet, not because Lenora was resistant, which Rosalie had expected, but because Lenora was not resistant. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything Rosalie told her about Whitlock, what he'd said about the documents, what he needed, what the cooperation meant versus the alternative, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her face very still. And when Rosalie finished, she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The contract is in the lining of my winter coat. I sewed it in. I didn't want your father's document case because I was afraid you'd find it." Rosalie stared at her. "I knew," Lenora said quietly. "Some part of me knew something was wrong, about the debt. But knowing and doing something about it, she stopped." She pressed her hands flat on the table, a gesture Rosalie recognized because she used it herself when she was steadying. "I was so afraid of losing the store, of losing everything your father built. And Silas was so certain about everything, and I was so uncertain about anything, and it was easy to believe someone who was certain when you were the other thing." "I know," Rosalie said. "I made it worse." Lenora looked at her. "I know I did. The things I to you," her voice caught briefly. "I was taking it out on you because you were the only person I could control. And you were the one person who was keeping things together, and I couldn't." She stopped again. "I couldn't admit that. Because if I admitted you were holding everything up, I had to admit I'd been depending on a 21-year-old girl to do what I should have been doing, and that I'd been hurting her while she did it." Rosalie sat across from her mother and said nothing for a moment. "Get the contract," she said finally. Lenora stood and went upstairs. She came back with a winter coat and a small folding knife, and she set both on the table and carefully opened the right side hem of the coat lining. She reached in and pulled out a folded document, slightly soft from being against the fabric for months. She put it on the table between them. Rosalie picked it up. She unfolded it. She read it. Her name was on it. Her name is Rosalie Fenwick, party to a marital arrangement with Silas Ketteridge, with a listed consideration of $912 in debt relief to be provided by Ketteridge to the Fenwick estate upon completion of the arrangement. $912 from a debt that had never existed. "He wrote your name in," Lenora said. "I told him you hadn't agreed yet. He said he'd handle that. What did you think that meant?" Lenora looked at her hands. "I told myself he meant he'd convince you." Rosalie set the document down. She looked at it for a moment, the way she looked at a set of figures she was about to correct measuring. What was wrong and what it would take to fix it. "This goes to Whitlock tomorrow morning," she said. Lenora nodded. "And you need to be prepared to tell him what you just told me." "All of it, including that you knew." Lenora flinched slightly, then nodded again. "Can you do that?" A pause, then quietly, "Yes." Rosalie refolded the contract and put it in her apron pocket with the careful handling she gave all the originals. "Good. I'll be at the store early tomorrow," she said. "The regular opening time. Nothing can look different." Lenora's voice was small. "If this works, after all of this, is there a way back between us?" Rosalie looked at her mother. She thought about 3 years of bruises. She thought about the salve tin Rourke had left on the counter. She thought about the private ledger inside the almanac, all those months of working alone, of knowing and having nowhere to put the knowing. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying I don't know yet." Again, the honest answer. She didn't have a more comforting one available. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. In the morning, she opened the store at 7 as always. She brewed coffee. She straightened the tin goods on the center shelf. She noted in the account book the previous day's closing balance. A woman came in for soap. A rancher came in for a new pair of work gloves and spent 10 minutes deciding between 2 weights of leather. At 9 o'clock, Rourke came in. "Decker and another man were outside the hotel last night," Rosalie said without preamble. Rourke's expression didn't change much, watching it. "Can't say for certain, but they weren't just passing." "Whitlock, no. I'll tell him this morning when I bring him the contract." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I think we're past the point where Silas is going to wait," he said. "I know he's going to move before Whitlock can get anything filed. Whatever he's going to do, he's going to go for the ledger," Rosalie said. "That's the thing he needs to destroy. Everything else is harder to eliminate. The banknote is a legal document with county registration. The Alderman and Greer accounts are at Whitlock's now, but the ledger is the core of the fraud documentation. If he gets that, the rest is harder to connect." "Where is it?" "Not here," she said. "I moved it last night. The original is at Irene Bellamy's school, locked in her desk. The copy is in the Pueblo Supplier correspondence file, which Silas has no reason to know exists." Rourke looked at her with the expression she'd started to associate with moments when something she'd done surprised him. "You moved it last night. After I got home from the hotel," she said. "You walked to the school in the dark. It's 3 blocks. He shook his head slightly, not in disapproval. "Something else." "All right," he said. "I'll be around the store today." "Visible but not obvious. Don't get in a fight," she said. "I know. Don't finish them either." "Not today. If Silas sends men here today, we let them look. There's nothing to find." He thought about this. "And if he comes himself?" "Then he comes himself." She set her pencil on the counter and looked at Rourke directly. He's going to come eventually. We both know that. Question is whether Whitlock has enough filed before it happens. How long does Whitlock need? He said he'd have the civil filing ready by tomorrow morning. The injunction request could go to the judge as early as tomorrow afternoon if Whitlock can get a meeting. That's a lot of tomorrows, Rourke said. Yes, she said. Customer came in, and Rosalie turned to serve them. And the morning moved the way mornings do ordinary on the outside. The whole complicated structure of what was building underneath invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She got through the morning. She got through the afternoon. And then at 20 minutes past 3, the door of Fenwick Mercantile opened with the particular energy of someone who was done waiting, and Silas Ketteridge walked in. And this time he had 4 men with him, and his face had dropped all the pleasant certainty it usually wore and replaced it with something colder and more direct. He looked at Rosalie behind the counter. "Where's the ledger?" he said. There were 3 customers in the store. Rosalie placed her hands flat on the counter. "Which one?" she said. Silas's jaw tightened. He took 2 steps toward the counter. One of his men moved toward the back of the store in the direction of the storeroom. Another positioned himself near the front door. "Don't play games with me," Silas said. "I know what you've been building. I know about the attorney. I know you've been talking to Alderman and that widow woman." He said it like each piece of information was a card he was putting on the table to show her the hand he held. "Whatever you've put together, it stops now. Give me the ledger, and we settle this privately." "There's nothing private about fraud," Rosalie said. One of the 3 customers, a woman near the flour barrels, took a step backward. Another, a rancher Rosalie recognized, went still in the careful way of a man deciding whether he was about to be needed. Silas leaned forward. His voice dropped to something quieter and more deliberate. "You don't know what you're doing. Whatever that attorney told you, whatever you think those papers prove, it won't hold. I have relationships with every judge in this district. I have freight contracts with half your neighbors. You burn this down, and you take everyone in this valley with you." Or, Rosalie said, keeping her voice even, "the fraud stops. The families you've been overcharging get compensated, and the valley goes back to functioning without your hand on the supply line." "That's not how this ends," Silas said. "It's how I'm ending it," she said. He reached across the counter. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He grabbed the edge of the account ledger, the current working ledger, the store's daily records, and pulled it toward him. And from the side of the store, a voice said, "Put it down." It was not Rourke. It was Irene Bellamy, standing near the dry goods shelf with her coat still on and her school bag in her hand and her eyes fixed on Silas with the precise, steady look of a woman who had spent 7 years managing 20 children and was not remotely intimidated by a man in an expensive coat. Silas stared at her. "That's a business record," Irene said. "You're not a party to it, and you have no right to it." The rancher near the back of the store straightened up. The woman near the flour barrels moved back to where she'd been standing, which was actually closer to the counter, not farther. Silas looked around the room. The 4 men he'd brought were still there, still positioned. But the room had shifted in some way that was difficult to name specifically the weight of it, the direction of it. The front door opened. Rourke came in. He didn't look at Silas's men by the door. He walked past them and across the store to the counter and stopped, and he looked at Silas. Silas let go of the ledger. He stepped back. He looked at Rosalie, and then at Irene, and then at the rancher who was watching from the back, and then at Rourke. "It's not," Rosalie agreed. "It'll be over when the territorial court says it is." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was calculating behind his eyes, she couldn't see it. He turned and walked to the door, and his men followed him out. The door closed. Nobody in the store moved for a moment. Then the rancher exhaled and said, well, in the tone of a man who has just watched something complicated and is still making sense of it. Irene set her bag down on the nearest shelf and looked at Rosalie. "I heard he might come today. I thought I should be close." Rosalie looked at her. "How did you hear?" "Clara Greer sent her oldest to find me." Irene adjusted her coat. "She's been watching the main road since morning." Rosalie looked at the 3 customers, the woman by the flour, the rancher, another man she'd recognized as a Hargrove hand. People who'd come in to buy things and stayed to witness something. People who were going to tell other people what they'd seen. "Thank you," she said to the room, to all of them. "Just buying salt," he said. But he didn't leave for another 20 minutes, and he positioned himself near the window the whole time, and Rosalie understood what that meant. She picked up the account ledger that Silas had grabbed and put it back in its place behind the counter. She checked that it was intact. Then she picked up her pencil. Tomorrow, Whitlock would file. Tonight, Silas Ketteridge would be deciding what to do about the fact that his scheme had just cracked open in front of witnesses. and Rosalie needed to be ready for whatever he decided. She began to write. Whitlock filed at 9 in the morning. Rosalie wasn't there when he did it. She was behind the counter of Fenwick Mercantile, opening the store the way she opened it every day. Because the most dangerous thing she could do right now was give Silas any reason to think something had changed. She brewed the coffee. She straightened the tin goods. She wrote the opening balance in the account ledger with the same pencil she used every morning. Outside, the main road was doing what it always did in the winter, a few horses, a few people moving with their heads down against the cold, the particular quiet of a town that didn't fully wake until the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She served 4 customers before 10 o'clock. Rourke came in at 10:30 and bought a tin of coffee he didn't need, which was his way of having a reason to be in the store without making it obvious he was there for a reason. Whitlock filed, he said quietly, while she made change. Civil action, and the injunction request. He rode to find Judge Harlan in Jericho Flats this morning. Harlan's the one he said was sympathetic. How long for the injunction? Whitlock said if Harlan reviews it today, we could have an emergency order by tomorrow. Maybe sooner if the documents read the way Whitlock thinks they'll read. Rosalie set the change on the counter, and Silas. His man Decker was outside the courthouse when Whitlock filed. He saw it happen. She absorbed this, so Silas knows. She picked up her pencil and went back to the ledger. Then we're in the part where he decides what he has left to lose. Rourke didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee tin and turned it in his hands. I want to move the original banknote, he said, the one Whitlock has a copy of. If Silas's people go into Whitlock's room at the hotel. It's not at the hotel, Rosalie said. Whitlock gave me the originals back last night before we parted. He kept certified copies. The originals are in the Pueblo supplier file. Rourke paused. The man thinks like a lawyer, and you think like someone who doesn't trust lawyers. I think like someone who's learned not to trust any single point of failure, she said. He almost smiled, not quite fair. He stayed near the window for another half hour and then left. Rosalie served 2 more customers, balanced the morning entries, and ate half a biscuit she'd brought from upstairs because she still wasn't managing regular meals. Then the afternoon started. It started with Vera Alderman. Vera came in at 1 o'clock with the energy of a woman who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it, which was different from Martin Alderman's deliberate steadiness, but came from the same place, a person who had been wronged and had finally found a direction to put their anger. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 40s with a practical face and an expression that didn't spend much time in neutral. I want to add to what Martin wrote, she said, setting her coat on the counter. He told the facts. I want to tell what it was like. Whitlock needs facts, Rosalie said carefully. Whitlock's going to present this to a judge, Vera said. Judges are people. People understand facts better when they understand what those facts felt like. She looked at Rosalie directly. My husband lost $200 that season. I know what $200 is. The children's winter boots and the seed for the spring and the roof repair we put off for another year because we didn't have it anymore. It's a year of tight and careful that didn't need to happen. Her jaw tightened. I want that in front of the judge. Rosalie put paper on the counter. Vera wrote for 20 minutes. What she produced was not a legal document in any formal sense, but it was the kind of specific human account of consequence that Whitlock had suggested a sympathetic judge would find difficult to dismiss. She wrote about the boots. She wrote about the seed. She wrote about Martin coming home from the confrontation with Silas's freight representative with the particular shutdown expression he got when something had gone badly and he didn't know how to fix it. She wrote it plainly and without embellishment, and it was in its way more damning than all the numbers. She signed it and dated it and pushed it across the counter. Clara Greer is coming this afternoon, she said, with her oldest girl. She didn't want to come alone. She doesn't have to, Rosalie said. Vera picked up her coat. There's something you should know. She paused, folding the coat over her arm. Mrs. Hargrove. At the post office. She's been saying things about you. Not to Silas, she's not that kind, but in the way women talk when they're nervous. Saying that you're stirring things up that don't need stirring. That it'll be worse for everyone if the freight routes get disrupted. Rosalie nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not saying it to discourage you. I'm saying it so you know it's not unanimous. Vera looked at her steadily. There are people in this town who would rather have a manageable injustice than an uncertain fight. Choice. But it shouldn't catch you off guard. It won't, Rosalie said. Thank you. After Vera left, Rosalie stood at the counter for a moment thinking about Mrs. Hargrove. Helen Hargrove was a cautious woman, not a bad one. She ran the post office with accuracy and kept everyone's business private and had never, as far as Rosalie knew, said anything deliberately unkind. Caution could work for or against you, depending on which direction it leaned, and in this case it was leaning toward stillness, toward staying in the place that was known, even if the known place had Silas's hand on it. Rosalie understood it. She didn't have the luxury of it. She went back to the accounts. Clara Greer arrived at 3, as Vera had said, with her daughter, a girl of about 12 named May, who sat on the customer chair with her hands in her lap and looked at Rosalie with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. Clara had brought her own account already written, which she set on the counter without preamble. "I added the part about the collection visit," Clara said. Specific words the man used. Rosalie read it. Specific words were detailed and ugly, in the particular way that coercive language is when it's written out plainly, the veneer of reasonableness stripped off, just the threat underneath. She noted 2 names Clara had included that she hadn't had before, the freight worker who'd delivered the false clause notification, and the name of a property in the next valley that Silas's company had apparently acquired under similar circumstances. "The property in the Pinto Valley," Rosalie said. "The one you mention here, do you know who owned it?" "The Whitfield family," Clara said. "They sold and moved east about 14 months ago. People said they'd had enough of the territory, but I always thought." "The Whitfields," Rosalie said, writing the name. "Do you have any contact for them?" "Their daughter married a man in Pueblo. I have her name somewhere." "Can you find it?" "I can try." Clara looked at the counter at the spread of papers, the ledger, the notes Rosalie was adding. "You've built a lot," she said quietly. "It built itself," Rosalie said. "I just kept the records." She made a copy of Clara's account and sent the original with a note to Whitlock's hotel room by way of Irene Bellamy's schoolboy, who was running messages between locations for a penny each and had developed the specific professional discretion of a child who understands that his income depends on not asking questions. Then she closed the store at 5:30, went upstairs, sat at the small desk in her room, and spent 2 hours reconstructing, purely from memory, every significant transaction she could recall from the past 18 months that she hadn't yet documented. Dates, parties, amounts, context. She had a strong memory. She'd always had it, the kind of memory that held figures and sequences without strain, and she used it now as she would have used any other tool, carefully and without waste. When she was done, she had 6 additional pages. She sat back and looked at what was spread across the desk. It was, she thought, a fairly complete picture of a man who had spent several years systematically dismantling the financial stability of an isolated valley town by operating below the level of visibility that would prompt collective response. Each individual harm was small enough to be managed alone. Together they were something else entirely. She folded the new pages, put them in the Pueblo supplier file, and went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well, but she slept. The injunction came on Friday. Whitlock sent word by way of Rourke at 7 in the morning, before the store opened. Judge Harlan had reviewed the documents Thursday evening and issued an emergency injunction that morning, freezing Silas Ketteridge's freight contract operations in the Coldwater Ridge Valley pending investigation of the fraud complaint. His accounts connected to the false debt collections were similarly frozen. The injunction gave the court 60 days to build the full evidentiary record for a formal proceeding. Rosalie read the summary Whitlock had written out twice. She put it down on the counter. She picked up her coffee and drank some of it. Then she said, "What did Silas do when he found out?" Rourke had heard secondhand, from a man who'd been at the freight office when the news arrived. "He was calm," Rourke said. "That's what this man said." Silas read the injunction notice and set it on his desk and said nothing for a while. Then he sent his men out. To do what? Don't know yet. Rosalie thought about this. A man like Silas, when his legal position collapsed, had 2 choices available. He could cooperate and try to minimize the damage, or he could move quickly against the things that had caused the collapse and accept the consequences later. The fact that he'd sent men out, rather than sitting quietly with a lawyer, suggested he was leaning toward the second. "The ledger copies," she said. "Where are they?" "Irene has the original." "The copy is in the Pueblo file." "There's a second copy." She stopped. She had made a 3rd copy 2 weeks ago and stored it somewhere she hadn't told anyone about, because she'd learned from her mother's experience with the document case that the safest information was information that only one person carried. She'd stored it in the lining of her own winter coat. Not as a deliberate echo of her mother's method, she'd thought of it independently and only realized the parallel later, which had made her sit very still for a moment before deciding it was still the right choice. "There's a second copy that's safe," she said. "That's enough." Rourke looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her when she'd just revealed the shape of something he hadn't known was there. "All right," he said. "What do you need today?" "I need to talk to Whitlock, and I need the store open by 7. She paused. and I need you to keep an eye on Irene's school. He pulled his coat straight. Done. The meeting with Whitlock happened at 9 in the back parlor of the hotel again. Whitlock had the injunction order spread on the table and was working through his next steps with the efficient, unhurried manner Rosalie had come to associate with how he operated. No wasted motion, no performance of urgency, just the systematic movement from one thing to the next. The injunction gives us time, he said, but it doesn't give us a conviction. For that, we need the full civil proceeding, and ideally, a territorial criminal referral. The civil proceeding I can run with what we have. The criminal referral requires the territorial prosecutor's office to take an interest. He looked at his notes. What would make them interested is evidence of the scheme operating across county lines. The Whitfield property in Pinto Valley, Rosalie said. Whitlock looked up. What do you know about that? She told him what Clara had said. He made notes. When she finished, he said, if the Whitfield acquisition followed the same pattern, false debt creation, coerced sale, and if we can reach the family, crosses the county line question and puts this in territorial jurisdiction rather than just local. Clara Greer is trying to find contact information for the Whitfield daughter. She's in Pueblo. If she can get it to me within the week. He made another note. This is moving faster than I expected, he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more the observation of a man recalibrating his schedule. Silas sent men out this morning, Rosalie said, after he received the injunction notice. Whitlock set his pen down, where I don't know yet. We need to know. He looked at her. If he's moving against the witnesses or the documents, before we can get everything certified for the proceeding, we need to know quickly. The injunction protects his commercial operations from continuing, but it doesn't protect people from intimidation. I know, she said. She knew it more concretely than she was showing. She'd thought about it on the walk over, about Clara and her daughter, about the Aldermans out on their ranch past the North Ridge, about Irene at the school with the ledger in her desk, about her own mother at the mercantile. Is there a way to get a protective order? She asked. For witnesses, yes. For property, more difficult. For documents, he paused. The documents are already certified by the court through the injunction filing. Destruction of them now would be obstruction. That's a criminal matter in itself. He looked at her. Does Ketteridge know that? I don't know what Ketteridge knows at any given moment, Rosalie said. He's a careful man. Careful men sometimes make impulsive decisions when the walls start moving, Whitlock said. She left the hotel at 10 and walked back to the store at the kind of measured pace that she'd learned over the years communicated nothing to anyone watching, not urgency, not fear, just a person moving from one place to another in the ordinary course of a morning. She went in through the front. Lenora was behind the counter, which was unusual. Lenora had not stood behind the counter regularly since Edmund died, leaving it to Rosalie by a kind of unspoken mutual agreement that had never been formally established. Rosalie stopped just inside the door. Lenora was serving a customer. Not fluently, she'd forgotten some of the rhythms of it, the shorthand of where things were and how to total quickly, but she was doing it, straightforwardly and without apparent distress. Customer Mrs. Payne from the south end of town was being patient in the specific way that people are patient when they can see someone trying. When Mrs. Payne left, Lenora looked at Rosalie. I thought you might need time this morning, she said. I did, Rosalie said, thank you. Lenora nodded and moved aside. She didn't go upstairs. She stayed in the store, dusting shelves that were already reasonably clean, rearranging a display of canned goods that didn't need rearranging, but staying present in the space she'd vacated 3 years ago. Rosalie went behind the counter and opened the ledger. At 11:30, one of Silas's men came in, not Decker this time. A younger man she didn't recognize, with the specific look of someone who'd been sent to observe rather than confront. He walked through the store slowly, looked at the shelves, didn't buy anything, and left. Lenora watched him go. Was that yes? Rosalie said. Lenora pressed her lips together. What does he want to know? Whether we're frightened, Rosalie said. Whether the injunction changed something visible about how we're operating. She went back to the ledger. He'll report that we opened on time, that the inventory is normal, that we served customers without incident. And that's good? That's exactly what we want him to report. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she moved to the counter and picked up a cloth and began wiping it down, a small, domestic action that was also, Rosalie realized, a deliberate positioning. She was standing behind the counter beside her daughter. Visible present, it was a small thing. It wasn't nothing. The afternoon brought 2 developments that arrived within an hour of each other and pulled the situation in directions Rosalie hadn't fully anticipated. The first was Martin Alderman, who came in at 2 with the specific controlled anger of a man who has just encountered something that confirmed his worst expectations. He went directly to the counter and kept his voice low. 2 of Silas's freight men came to my ranch this morning, he said. Said they were there about a routine contract review. What did they actually do? Rosalie said. Looked at my outbuildings. Specifically the one where I keep the contract files and the equipment records. He paused. They didn't touch anything, but they looked, long enough to see what was where. Rosalie felt something cold move through her chest. They were seeing where your papers are. That's what I think. Alderman's jaw was tight. I moved everything this afternoon. Into the house, upstairs, under the floor panel in the children's room. Good. The thing is, he stopped, and the thing he was stopping on was visible in his face. Vera was home alone when they came. The boys are at school until 4. Rosalie looked at him. She understood what he wasn't quite saying. His wife had been alone on a property out of town with 2 of Silas's men who were measuring her outbuildings. It hadn't become anything beyond that, but the possibility of what it could become was now visible in a way it hadn't been before. I don't think Silas would move that direction, she said carefully. I didn't think he'd invent $900 of debt either, Alderman said. She had no answer for that. I'm not pulling out, he said before she could speak. I want to be clear. I'm not backing away from the statement or from Whitlock. But I want you to understand what I'm risking. I do understand, she said. Do you have any sense of how long this takes, the court proceeding? Whitlock says the civil hearing could be within 30 days of the filing, given the emergency injunction. Criminal referral would take longer, but by then Silas's commercial operations are frozen and his ability to threaten anyone's supply is significantly reduced. Alderman considered this, 30 days, maybe less. He nodded. Once all right, he turned to go, then turned back. There's a man named Hanson, out near Pecos Creek. I mentioned him before. I think he's had similar trouble with the freight contracts. He's not going to come to you. He doesn't trust people easily, and he's had a hard few years. But if someone went to him, Rourke, Rosalie said. Possibly. Rourke did some work for him as well, I think, a while back. If he went out there and just talked to the man, I'll mention it. The second development came at 3 o'clock in the form of a letter, delivered not through the post office but by hand a boy she didn't recognize, paid to carry it, who gave it to her and left without waiting for a response. The letter was from Silas. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was almost pleasant. It acknowledged that a legal process had been initiated and expressed his intention to cooperate fully with any legitimate inquiry into his business practices. The second paragraph noted that the injunction was the result of incomplete information and that once the full picture of his arrangements with various Valley families was properly understood, the court would find everything in order. The third paragraph was the one that mattered. It said, without quite saying, that the process of legal dispute was long and expensive and disruptive, and that a private resolution one that addressed any legitimate concerns Rosalie might have about the Fenwick accounts was still available and would serve everyone better than a prolonged public proceeding. Private resolution. She read it twice, then she folded it and set it on the counter. Lenora, who had been close enough to see the expression on Rosalie's face, said, "What is it?" Rosalie looked at her. "He wants to settle quietly." Before it goes any further, Lenora's hands stilled on the shelf she'd been restocking. Would that be enough? For us? For us, maybe, Rosalie said. For the Aldermans, no. For Clara Greer and her children, no. For the Whitfield family who sold their property in Pinto Valley for less than it was worth because he manufactured a debt, no. She picked up the letter and put it in her apron pocket with the others. This isn't just about us anymore. Lenora looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, not argument, not agreement, just the slow process of understanding something she should have understood sooner. No, she said quietly. I suppose it isn't. Rosalie took the letter to Whitlock that evening. He read it without visible reaction. Then he set it down and said, "This is good." "How is a settlement offer good?" she said. "Because it's an acknowledgement. A man who had nothing to worry about wouldn't be offering to settle." He looked at the letter again. "He's also making a legal mistake. If he approaches any of the other witnesses directly with a settlement offer while the court proceeding is active, that's interference. I'll inform Alderman and Greer and the Bellamy woman to document any contact." He looked at Rosalie. "Don't respond to this. I wasn't going to. Don't respond through anyone else either. If he reaches out again, you tell me first." She nodded and left. Walking back, she passed the schoolhouse. The light was out. Irene would have gone home an hour ago, but she stopped in front of it anyway and looked at the dark window. Behind that window in the locked desk was the original private ledger. 4 months of parallel tracking, the record that had started all of this. She thought about the night she'd started it, sitting in the storeroom with the almanac cover open and a fresh page in front of her, just tracking numbers because they didn't add up, and she couldn't leave something that didn't add up alone. Not because she'd known where it would lead, because she was the person who kept the books, and the books weren't right, and that mattered to her. Some things were simply that plain. She walked home. The following 3 days were the strangest of the whole proceeding, in the way that the period just before something breaks is always strange, too quiet, too normal on the surface, with a sense underneath it of pressure building toward a resolution that hasn't yet declared itself. Whitlock worked through the documentation. Rourke rode out to the Hanson property and spent an afternoon with the man, and came back saying Hanson was willing to speak to the attorney but not to sign anything yet, which was a partial thing but still more than nothing. Clara Greer found the contact information for the Whitfield daughter in Pueblo and sent a letter through Rourke on his return to Durango for a court filing. Silas sent no more letters. He did not come to the store. He was, as far as anyone could determine, meeting with lawyers. That was in its way the most alarming development. A man with lawyers who was being quiet was either accepting defeat or building something. Rosalie did not believe Silas Ketteridge was the kind of man who accepted defeat quietly and moved on. The answer came on Thursday morning, not at the store but at the courthouse in Jericho Flats, where Whitlock had gone the previous day to file the additional materials from the Whitfield correspondence. Rourke came back from Jericho Flats at noon with news that Whitlock had sent verbally because he didn't want it in writing yet. Silas had filed a counter-complaint. He was claiming that the documents Rosalie had compiled were falsified, that she had altered the original freight invoices to misrepresent the amounts, and that the banknote she'd presented was a forgery. Rosalie stared at Rourke. He's saying, "I falsified the evidence," she said.
Yes.
The original banknote has county registration. It's a registered legal document. I didn't create it. I know that. The freight invoices, I've kept the original separately from day one. Unaltered. The dates on the paper, the ink composition, anyone who looks at them. Whitlock knows all of this, Rourke said. He said, "Don't panic." He said this is a delay tactic, and he anticipated something like it. Rosalie stood at the counter and worked through it. A forgery claim against the documents meant Silas was trying to shift the proceeding from a question of his guilt to a question of her credibility. If he could get the court focused on whether she'd altered anything, even if the answer was demonstrably no, the proceeding slowed, the witnesses became more hesitant, and the narrative changed from fraud exposure to competing claims. It was the move of someone who couldn't win on the evidence and knew it, so was trying to change what the proceeding was about. "What does Whitlock need?" she said. "The original invoices. All of them, the unaltered ones." Rourke met her eyes. "He needs to present them to a court document examiner who can confirm their age and authenticity. That examination should settle the forgery claim, but it takes a few days." "The originals are in the Pueblo file," Rosalie said. She was already moving toward the storeroom. She pulled the Pueblo supplier file from the back of the third shelf. She opened it. She went through the folders one by one. The invoices were there. She stood with them in her hands and let out a slow breath. "I need to get these to Whitlock today," she said. "Can you ride?" "Yes." She caught herself. Rourke almost smiled. "I know." She wrapped the invoices carefully in oilcloth and gave them to him. He left through the back. She went back to the counter and stood there for a moment, with her hands flat on the surface, the same posture she'd seen her mother use the night they'd talked in the kitchen, she realized, though she'd arrived at it independently. Steadying. Silas had moved from intimidation to legal counterattack. Shift. It meant the injunction had landed harder than he'd wanted, and he was recalibrating, using the legal system as a delay mechanism, the same way he'd used intimidation as a control mechanism. Different tools, same objective. The store was quiet. Lenora was in the back, doing inventory. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the sky had the particular flat gray quality that in Colorado usually meant snow by evening. Rosalie thought about the Whitfields in Pueblo, a family she'd never met, who'd moved east under pressure, and probably thought they'd left the whole thing behind. She thought about Clara Greer and May sitting in their house on the east end of town, waiting to see which way this fell. She thought about Martin Alderman, who'd moved his contract files to the floor panel in the children's room. All of it held together or fell together. She picked up her pencil. There was one more thing she could do, something she'd been thinking about for several days and had kept setting aside because it felt presumptuous, like reaching for something larger than the immediate problem. But the immediate problem kept getting larger, whether she reached for it or not. She pulled a clean sheet of paper from the stack and began to write a letter. Not to Whitlock, not to the court, not to any party in the proceeding. She wrote it to every female shopkeeper and widow in the territory whose name she could find in the trade circulars she'd been receiving for 3 years. She did not make any claims about what she'd proven or what the court would do. She wrote simply that she had found irregularities in her accounts that appeared to originate a freight arrangement, and that she would share her records with any merchant who wanted to compare. She wrote her name and the address of Fenwick Mercantile clearly at the bottom. She wrote 12 copies by hand. She folded and addressed them. Then she went to the post office. Helen Hargrove was behind the counter, and she looked at the stack of letters with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very curious. Outgoing, Rosalie said, all of them. Helen processed them without comment. At the last one she paused and looked up. Rosalie, her voice was careful. I heard what you're doing, with the court and the attorney and all of it. I imagine most people have, Rosalie said. I said some things. Helen looked at the counter. About stirring things up, I know. Helen met her eyes. I was afraid. I've got a postal route that depends on Ketteridge's freight network to bring the supply wagon. If he decides to, I know, Rosalie said again. I'm not proud of it. Helen pushed the letters through to the outgoing bin. I'm not saying anything against you. I haven't. But I haven't been what I should be either. She paused. My husband's account. With the freight company. There are some irregularities I've been looking at for a while. Rosalie looked at her. I'm not making any promises, Helen said quickly. I'm just saying it out loud to someone. That's enough, Rosalie said. For now, that's enough. She walked back to the store in the flat gray afternoon, with the snow starting to come down in small, determined flakes, the kind that meant business. She thought about the 12 letters in the outgoing bin. She thought about Whitlock with the invoices, building the case against the forgery claim. She thought about Rourke on the road in the coming snow and whether he'd taken his heavy coat. She thought about the moment, more than 2 weeks ago now, when Silas had thrown the ledger on the floor and she'd stood with her pencil in her hand and decided, quietly and without drama, that she was done being a person things happened to. The snow was falling steadily by the time she reached the mercantile. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the sign above the door, faded letters. Edmund Fenwick's handwriting, 8 years old, and still legible if you knew what you were reading. She was going to repaint it in the spring. She'd been thinking about that for a while. She went inside, turned the sign on the door, started the closing count. The numbers lined up clean, the way they always did when she checked them. She wrote the closing balance, capped her pen, and went upstairs to eat something before the next day started. The document examiner came from Santa Fe. Whitlock had requested him through the territorial court a man named Prentice, who specialized in authenticating legal documents and had spent 20 years doing it for courts across the Southwest. He arrived on a Tuesday, examined the freight invoices for 4 hours in a room at the Jericho Flats courthouse, and produced a written finding the following morning. The invoices were authentic, original ink on original paper, consistent with the dates recorded on them. No alterations, no erasures, no evidence of tampering of any kind. Silas's forgery claim collapsed in a single document. Rosalie read Whitlock's summary of the finding while standing at the mercantile counter with her coat still on from the morning cold, and she read it with the specific flat attention she brought to numbers that had finally reconciled after a long discrepancy, not triumph, just the clean recognition of something settling into its correct place. She set the paper down. She took her coat off. She opened the ledger and started the morning count. Rourke came in at 8 and saw her expression and said, "Good news?" "The forgery claim is finished," she said. Prentice found the invoices authentic. Rourke was quiet for a moment, so the proceeding moves forward. She made an entry in the account book. Whitlock says the civil hearing is set for 3 weeks from Friday in Jericho Flat. He's also filed the criminal referral with the territorial prosecutor's office in Denver, using the Whitfield property transfer as the cross-county evidence. Denver, Rourke said. That's a different level of attention. Yes, she said, it is. He poured himself coffee from the corner stove and leaned against the wall near the window in the way he'd been doing for weeks now present, but not hovering close but not crowding. She'd come to find it steadying without quite being able to articulate why. It wasn't protection exactly. It was more like the specific comfort of knowing that someone who could leave kept choosing not to. Hansen came in yesterday, she said. Rourke looked up. I heard. Did he? He signed a statement, 17 months of inflated freight costs and one instance of what sounds like outright coercion involving a property boundary dispute. She paused. He was apologetic about it. The fact that he hadn't said something sooner. He kept saying he should have known better. People don't know what they don't know, Rourke said. That's what I told him. She looked at the ledger. He also told me there are 2 more families in the Pecos Creek area who he believes have had similar experiences. He said he'd talk to them. Silas built this over a long time, Rourke said quietly. Piece by piece, each piece looked small. That's how it works, Rosalie said. You keep each individual harm just below the threshold where someone feels they have standing to fight back. And you count on people not comparing notes. She looked up. The only thing that undoes it is when they do. The days that followed had a different quality from the weeks before, still tense, still uncertain in places, but moving forward rather than spinning in place. Whitlock communicated regularly through Rourke, who rode between Coldwater Ridge and Jericho Flats with the steady reliability of someone who had simply decided this was his work now. Rosalie did not ask him about that decision. She accepted it the way she accepted most things that were useful and honest directly and without ceremony. Silas attempted 2 more legal maneuvers in the weeks before the civil hearing. The first was a challenge to the injunction on procedural grounds that Whitlock described, with the closest thing to dry amusement she'd ever heard from him, as creative. The challenge was denied. The second was a motion to exclude the Alderman and Greer statements as hearsay, which had slightly more legal grounding and required Whitlock to file a response brief. The motion was also denied, on the basis that the statements were made in anticipation of litigation and met the established exceptions. Rosalie read each ruling summary with the same focused attention she brought to her ledgers. Silas was spending. Every legal maneuver cost money and time and ground, and each denial narrowed the space available for the next one. She understood this kind of arithmetic. It was the arithmetic of attrition, and she'd been running it in the back of her mind since the first morning she'd spread the private ledger on the storeroom crate. A man with resources could sustain losses longer than a man without them, but he could not sustain them indefinitely. At some point, the cost of continuing exceeded the value of what was being defended. Silas had not reached that point yet, but he was moving toward it. 2 weeks before the civil hearing, a letter arrived from Denver. It was addressed to Whitlock, but he brought it to Rosalie personally, which told her its contents before she read it. He came to the store in the late afternoon when the customers had thinned, sat in the chair near the window, and handed her the letter without preamble. The territorial prosecutor's office had opened a formal criminal investigation into Silas Ketteridge's commercial operations across 3 counties. They were requesting all documentation Whitlock had compiled, certified copies of witness statements, and access to the original court-registered banknote. They were also, the letter noted, in contact with law enforcement in Pueblo regarding the Whitfield property transfer. Rosalie read it through twice. This is bigger than the civil proceeding, she said. Significantly, Whitlock said, the civil hearing next week addresses your family's specific damages and those of the identified witnesses. This, he tapped the letter. This is the territorial government looking at a criminal enterprise operating across county lines. If the Denver office builds the case they're building, we're talking about fraud convictions, potential imprisonment, and the full disgorgement of assets acquired through the scheme. She looked at the letter. The Whitfields. Their daughter in Pueblo responded to my contact last month. She confirmed her family sold under coercion following a manufactured debt claim. She has documentation. Whitlock folded his hands. Rosalie, the 12 letters you mailed to the merchants and widows in the territory, has anything come back from those? She looked at him. 7 responses so far. 3 said they'd had no problems. 4 described situations that sounded consistent with what I'd found. I forwarded all 4 to you last week. I received them. He was quiet for a moment. Those 4, combined with what we already have, suggest this has been operating for at minimum 4 years across a significant geographic area. He looked at her steadily. The ledger you kept. The 4 months of parallel tracking that started all of this. Prosecutor is going to want to understand how you came to keep it. The numbers didn't add up, she said. That's it? That's it. Whitlock looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, you should know that what you've built here, the evidentiary record, the witness coordination, the document preservation, this is not the work of an untrained person who got lucky. This is methodical, careful work. A prosecutor is going to notice that. She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded and gave him the coffee she'd poured when he arrived. The civil hearing took place on a Friday in the middle of February, in the Jericho Flats courthouse, a plain wood frame building that smelled of pine and old paper and served as both courtroom and town meeting hall, depending on the day of the week. Rosalie had never been inside a courtroom before. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Whitlock on her left, and Martin Alderman and Vera and Clara Greer in the row behind her, and she kept her hands folded on the table, because folding them kept them still. and she looked at the documents spread in front of Whitlock with the focused attention of someone who understood every number on every page. Silas sat at the defense table across the room with two lawyers from Denver. He was dressed better than she'd ever seen him, a good dark suit, polished boots, hair combed with care. He looked like a successful man, which was precisely what he'd built his entire operation on looking like. He did not look at Rosalie directly when he came in. That told her something. The proceedings lasted most of the day. Whitlock was methodical and precise, and presented the evidence in the sequence Rosalie had organized it from the original banknote through the false debt creation, through the inflated freight invoices, through the coerced payment pattern, through the marriage contract with its fraudulent consideration. He called Martin Alderman, who testified with the flat, specific accuracy of a man stating measurable facts. He called Clara Greer, who was more nervous but steadied as she spoke, and who at one point produced from memory the exact language Silas's collector had used when citing the false contract clause, which she repeated word for word in the quiet courtroom, with the kind of clarity that comes from replaying something in your head too many times. The defense challenged. They challenged the chain of custody of the documents. They challenged the admissibility of the Greer account. They challenged Rosalie's qualifications to interpret financial records. On that last point, Whitlock asked the judge for permission to demonstrate. He put a set of freight invoices on the table, originals and the inflated versions, and asked Rosalie to walk the court through the discrepancies. She did. She went through 6 invoices in about 12 minutes, explaining each inflated figure, the pattern of the rounding errors, the systematic nature of the overcharges. She spoke the way she always spoke about numbers, directly, without ornamentation, pointing to the specific figure on the specific line. When she finished, the judge looked at the defense table. "Objection withdrawn," one of the Denver lawyers said, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier confidence. Silas's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table in front of him. The ruling came at 4 p.m. The court found for the plaintiffs on all primary claims. The fraudulent debt was declared void. All payments made to Silas Ketteridge by the Fenwick estate in excess of the legitimate banknote balance were ordered, returned a sum of $432 that Whitlock had calculated from the full document record. Similar findings were made for the Alderman and Greer claims. The marriage contract was declared unenforceable in its entirety, having been entered into through fraudulent misrepresentation of the debt consideration. The freight contracts Silas held with the Valley families were voided where they'd been obtained under coercion. Criminal referral to Denver was formally endorsed by the court as a recommended priority. Rosalie sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to the ruling and kept her hands folded and her face still because she was in a courtroom, and this was not the place to be anything other than composed. But underneath that composure, something was happening that she didn't have a clean word for. Not exactly relief, not exactly vindication, not exactly joy. Something quieter. The feeling of a load that has been carried a long distance finally being set down on solid ground. Behind her, she heard Vera Alderman exhale. Outside the courthouse, in the cold February air, Martin Alderman shook her hand once, hard, and said, "Good work." And that was all he said, which was exactly the right amount. Vera hugged her briefly and firmly, the hug of someone who is not generally given to demonstrations, but meant it fully when she made them. Clara Greer stood with May beside her and looked at Rosalie with wet eyes and said, "Thank you." And Rosalie said, "You did this too. All of you did, because it was true and it mattered that it was said." Rourke was waiting by the horses. He looked at her when she came down the courthouse steps, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was fine. They had, she thought, gotten quite good at the particular communication of silence, the kind that meant something had been acknowledged, without requiring the architecture of words to hold it up. "It went through," she said. "I could tell from the building," he said. Something about how people came out, she almost laughed. Came out as a short, rough sound that surprised her. All of it. Whitlock got everything. The criminal referral? Endorsed. He nodded. He untied her horse and held the reins while she mounted, which was one of those small practical courtesies he offered without ceremony, and she accepted without commentary. They rode back toward Coldwater Ridge in the late afternoon, the light going long and golden across the snow, and she let herself ride without thinking about the next thing for most of the journey, a luxury she had not permitted herself in a very long time. About halfway home, he said, "What happens to the store now?" "The returned money covers the actual bank balance with some left over," she said. "I've been in contact with the Pueblo supplier independently for 2 months. The freight route is slightly longer, but the pricing is better than what Silas was charging after his inflations. She looked at the road ahead. I want to add hardware, ranch supplies. There are 6 properties within a day's ride that are currently going to Jericho Flats for things I could be stocking. Rourke was quiet for a moment. That's going to need more space in the store. I've been measuring the back room, she said. If I knock out the partition between the storeroom and the old coal storage, I get another 18 feet of floor space. That partition is load-bearing, he said. She looked at him. How do you know that? I looked at it last week. She looked back at the road. Why were you looking at the partition last week? Because you've been measuring the back room for a month, and I figured eventually you were going to want to know if the wall could come down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then can it? With the right support beam, yes, it's doable. Takes about a week of work. Do you know how to put in a support beam? I know how to do most things that involve not wanting a building to fall on me, he said. This time the almost law was warmer. All right, she said. We'll talk about it. They rode the rest of the way home without solving the partition problem, which was fine because neither of them was in a hurry. What followed in the weeks after the civil hearing was not a sudden transformation. That was the thing about real change. It didn't arrive all at once like a curtain going up. It arrived in pieces, unevenly, with setbacks and friction, and the persistent difficulty of old habits meeting new circumstances. The Denver prosecutor's criminal case against Silas Ketteridge took 4 months to build fully, and during those 4 months Silas was present in the valley, restricted in his commercial operations by the injunction, but not absent. He moved carefully. He did not approach any of the witnesses. He did not come to the mercantile, but he was there, and his being there had a weight to it that Rosalie felt on the days she let herself feel it. She mostly didn't let herself feel it. There was too much work. The responses to her letters continued arriving through March and into April 12 total by the end, from women across the territory who described situations that ranged from clearly consistent with Silas's pattern to possibly unrelated to certainly something else entirely. She forwarded all of them to Whitlock and to the Denver office and let the professionals sort them out. 3 of them became additional evidence in the criminal case. One of them connected to a property scheme in a county she'd never heard of that turned out to have nothing to do with Silas but was its own separate problem. Which was the kind of thing that happened when you open doors. Sometimes what came through wasn't what you'd expected. The Whitfield family in Pueblo received a court-ordered settlement from the proceeds of the civil judgment against Silas in connection with their property transfer. Rosalie never met them. She got a letter from the daughter in May, 3 lines long, that said thank you and mentioned that her father was not in good health but had cried when they told him the settlement had come through. She kept that letter in the almanac beside the private ledger because it seemed like the right place for it. Helen Hargrove at the post office did eventually bring her account records to Whitlock. The irregularities in her husband's freight contracts turned out to be less severe than she'd feared, more on the edge of the scheme than its center, but they were real, and they were documented, and they were added to the record. Helen came into the mercantile the week after and bought salt and coffee and stood at the counter for a moment after Rosalie made change and said, "I should have said something sooner." "You said it when you were ready," Rosalie said. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one." She handed Helen her change. Ready matters more than early, sometimes. Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and left. The criminal verdict came in June. Silas Ketteridge was convicted on 7 counts of commercial fraud and 2 counts of criminal coercion, the latter applying to the Whitfield property transfer and to the documented threat made against Clara Greer regarding her freight contract. He was sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison in Cannon City and ordered to disgorge all assets acquired through the scheme, a process that Whitlock described as complicated and that took the better part of another year to fully execute, but which resulted eventually in the return of funds to every identified victim. He was also permanently stripped of his freight licenses. On the day the verdict came through, Rosalie was behind the counter of Fenwick Mercantile doing the morning accounts. Rourke came in and told her, and she listened and said 4 years. Yes, she thought about that. It should be longer, she said. Probably, he agreed. But the disgorgement, the licenses, she looked at the ledger. Can't do it again. Not here, not anywhere in the territory. No, he can't, she wrote the morning's opening balance. Rourke stayed near the window. She thought about what 4 years meant and what it didn't mean and decided, in the end, that the number mattered less than what had been taken away from him, not his freedom, exactly, but his mechanism. The system he'd built over years, the web of false debts and coerced contracts and manufactured obligations, the network of fear that had kept people isolated and comparing nothing. That was gone. You couldn't rebuild that easily. Maybe you couldn't rebuild it at all once people understood what it looked like. That was the thing worth marking. By late summer, Fenwick Mercantile looked different from the outside and considerably different from the inside. The partition between the storeroom and the coal storage had come down in April, replaced by a support beam that Rourke and Martin Alderman had installed over 4 days with a degree of coordinated disagreement about technique that suggested both men were right about different parts of the problem. The additional floor space had been converted to a hardware section: tools, nails, rope, replacement harness hardware, a selection of hinges and bolts that Rosalie had researched carefully, because ordering the wrong sizing was the kind of mistake that made ranchers never come back. The sign above the door had been repainted in May. Same letters as Edmund Fenwick's original, same placement, different hand. Rosalie had done it herself on a dry Sunday morning, standing on a stepladder with a brush and a pot of dark paint, and had taken considerably longer than she'd expected because her father's original letters had a slight lean to the left that she'd preserved because it seemed important to preserve it. Lenora had stood below the ladder and said, "You're matching his slant." He would have liked that. Rosalie kept painting. They were not restored, she and her mother. Rosalie did not pretend they were. There were still mornings where she woke from a bad dream that had bruises in it and lay in the dark and thought about things that had no clean resolution, about years that couldn't be returned, about the specific loneliness of being in danger in a place that was supposed to be home. Those mornings existed. She didn't perform her way through them. She got up and made coffee and opened the store, but Lenora was different. Not transformed Rosalie was suspicious of transformation, which happened in stories more reliably than in people. What Lenora was changed in smaller ways that accumulated into something. She was present. She was in the store every day, working. Actually working, not hovering at the edges of the labor, but in it, learning back the rhythms she'd abandoned, asking Rosalie questions about the accounts without the defensive edge that used to accompany any conversation about money. She'd taken over the morning supplier correspondence, which freed up an hour of Rosalie's evenings. She'd also once, on a Wednesday in March, said out loud to a customer who'd made an offhand comment about Rosalie's size that Rosalie ran the best-managed store in the valley, and the customer could keep his opinions to himself. Customer had been surprised. Rosalie, who'd been in the back room and overheard it, had been surprised too. She hadn't said anything about it, but she'd thought about it for a while. The partnership, such as it was imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable and required a degree of deliberate navigation that a person in an easier situation might have avoided. But it was real. It was built on what was actually there, rather than on what they wished were there, and Rosalie had come to think that was probably the only kind of partnership worth having. The letter she'd written to the territory's merchants had, by June, generated something she hadn't entirely anticipated: correspondence. Not just the 12 initial responses, but subsequent letters, women, and some men asking practical questions about how she'd identified the fraud, how she'd organized the documentation, what an attorney needed to build a case. One woman in Taos wrote 3 pages about a situation with a land agent that sounded serious and very specific. Rosalie wrote back to all of them as carefully as she could, within the limits of what she actually knew and wasn't. She was not an attorney, she said so plainly in every letter. She was a shopkeeper who kept accurate books. She could tell them what she'd looked for and how she'd organized what she found. She could give them Whitlock's contact information. She could tell them that the thing she'd found most useful, in the end, was simply not being alone, and that being alone was frequently a condition that could be changed, even when it felt permanent. She didn't know if any of those letters led anywhere. She might never know. That was the thing about actions that moved outward into the world. They moved beyond your ability to track them, and you had to make a kind of peace with not getting to see the full accounting. She was working on that. One evening in late August, she found Rourke fixing the side door of the mercantile, the same door he'd come through. The first morning, he'd walked in with mud on his boots and a list that included an axe handle and a question about a man's infected hand. The door had developed a problem with its lower hinge over the summer, which she'd been meaning to address and hadn't, and he'd apparently noticed and was addressing it without being asked. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a moment. "You planning on staying?" she said. He looked up. He had a screwdriver in his hand and a nail between his teeth, and he took the nail out before he answered. "That depends. On what? On whether you want me here." She thought about the question, not because the answer was uncertain, but because the question deserved actual thinking rather than automatic response. She thought about the morning he'd put the salve tin on the counter and looked at her like a person he could see. She thought about him sitting in the chair by the window while she worked, keeping watch without turning it into a performance. She thought about the partition beam and the ride back from Jericho Flats, and the way he'd held the reins of her horse without making it mean more than it was, and the way he'd told her about his mother's trading post in the high country with his hat in his hand, the one time he'd let her see something that cost him something to say. He wasn't a smooth man. He was a practical man with a history he didn't talk about much, and a way of being helpful that didn't announce itself. He was the first person who had looked at her in 3 years and seen before anything else that she was the most competent person in the room. That was not nothing. I do, she said. He stayed. They did not rush toward anything. There was no ceremony to what developed between them, no grand declarations, no sudden resolution of all difficulties into something comfortable and easy. What there was time. Conversations over the closing accounts. Mornings where he came in early and built the fire in the corner stove before she came down. A disagreement in October about the pricing strategy for the new hardware section that lasted 3 days, and was resolved by Rosalie being correct, and Rourke saying so plainly when the first month's sales proved it. "You don't hold grudges," he observed, after the hardware pricing disagreement was settled. "I hold them," she said. "I just don't carry them into the store. Bad for the accounts." He laughed at that, a real one, not the almost law she'd catalogued from the early weeks. She filed it away. They married in the spring quietly, with Martin and Vera Alderman as witnesses, and Irene Bellamy standing in the back of the room, with the expression of someone who has watched something develop slowly and correctly and finds the conclusion satisfying without being surprised by it. Lenora was there, she cried, which surprised nobody. She and Rosalie had not spoken about what the crying meant, which was fine. Some things communicated themselves adequately without annotation. Rosalie remained co-owner of Fenwick Mercantile and chief keeper of the accounts. That was non-negotiable, and she had said so clearly before anything was settled, not because she expected an argument she hadn't from Rourke, but because she'd learned that the things that mattered most needed to be said plainly rather than assumed into existence. Rourke built the store's freight network across the high country. He knew the routes and the ranches and the specific character of mountain passage in various seasons, and he could negotiate with suppliers in a way that was less about aggression and more about the reliable trust that comes from doing what you said you would do, which turned out to be rare enough that it was its own kind of leverage. Within 2 seasons, Fenwick Mercantile was supplying 7 properties that had previously hauled their own goods from Jericho Flats. Lenora worked beside them. She had become, in the practical reality of daily operations, something like a manager of the household supply function, the domestic goods, the textile orders, the things that required taste rather than calculation. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it, before everything had gone wrong. Coming back to it was not triumphant, but it was genuine. She never hit Rosalie again. That was not discussed. It simply ceased. Rosalie noticed its cessation the way you notice when a sound that has been constant stops suddenly. The silence has a shape. She did not forgive her mother in any clean, definitive way. She moved toward her, gradually and with caution, the way you move toward anything that has caused real harm, not forgetting what it was capable of, but choosing to remain in the same space because the space was worth remaining in. It was a choice she made on an ongoing basis rather than once. Some mornings it was easier than others. That was honest. She preferred honest to smooth. In the fall of the year after the conviction, a letter arrived from a woman in Albuquerque who had read about the territorial fraud case through a Santa Fe newspaper and wanted to know how Rosalie had started, how she'd known where to look, how she'd found the courage to keep looking after Silas had grabbed her wrist and the whole town had looked the other way. Rosalie sat with the letter for an evening before she answered it. What she wrote back was not particularly eloquent. She told the woman that she hadn't had a special insight or a plan. She'd had a ledger that didn't add up. She'd had months of sitting alone with numbers that were wrong and the stubbornness not to pretend they were right. She'd had a practical man who had left a tin of salve on her counter and asked her a simple question without making it complicated. She'd had people who, when it mattered, had stepped beside her instead of away from her. She told the woman that the courage part was more complicated to explain. She hadn't thought of it as courage. She'd thought of it as arithmetic. This is what's true, this is what it costs, this is what happens if I do nothing. The cost of doing nothing had been higher than the cost of acting, and she'd done the calculation and moved accordingly. She told the woman that the hardest part wasn't the fraud or the legal proceeding or even Silas standing in her store with his hand on her wrist. The hardest part was the years before, the years of making herself smaller, of accepting the reality that was handed to her because there seemed to be no other available reality. That shrinking was the real damage. Everything else was a consequence. She sent the letter. She went back to the counter and opened the ledger. On the shelf in the storeroom, in its place between the others, the almanac with the private ledger inside its cover still sat where she'd put it. She hadn't moved it. It had occurred to her to move it, to put it somewhere more formal, or to give it to Whitlock for the court record, or to simply throw it away now that everything was resolved. But she'd left it. It was the record of where this had started. The 4 months of careful solitary tracking before any of it was visible to anyone else. The work done in the dark before the door opened. She thought it deserved to stay where it was. Coldwater Ridge talked about Rosalie Fenwick for years. Not the way it had talked before, not the whispers about her weight, the assessments of her marriageability, the quiet consensus that she was someone who could be managed and disregarded. They talked about her the way people talk about someone who changed the shape of a place. The woman whose ledger brought down Silas Ketteridge. The shopkeeper who kept records when everyone else kept quiet. The one who sent letters to strangers and got letters back and built, out of nothing but accurate numbers and stubbornness, and a few people who showed up when it mattered, something that held. She never particularly liked being talked about, but she had stopped making herself smaller to avoid it. She had stopped that the morning she'd walked through her own front door with the ledger under her arm and her head up, in front of everyone who had watched and said nothing, and she had not lowered it again. The town had looked at her once and decided she was someone who could be ignored, traded, and controlled. They had been wrong. And the cowboy who had first said so out loud was, by then, fixing the back fence of the mercantile in the late afternoon sun, doing it without being asked because he'd noticed it needed doing, the way he noticed most things quietly, and without making a show of the noticing. That was who he was. And who she was the woman who had been carrying the weight of an entire failing business on her own shoulders while the world looked the other way, and had looked back at all of it and had kept her books clean. She had never needed anyone to give her that. She had needed sometimes for someone to see it. Some people wait their whole lives for that. Some people never find it. Rosalie had found it in a bad winter, in a struggling store, in the specific dignity of numbers that told the truth even when everything else refused to, and she had not wasted it.